I drove up to the cabin alone, the gravel crunching under my tires as I pulled into the narrow clearing. It was late October, and the trees were nearly bare, their twisted branches reaching up toward the sky. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. I shut off the engine, listening to the eerie silence that followed. This place was meant to be a getaway, a weekend of quiet, away from work and the constant hum of the city. My cousin had offered the cabin, saying he hadn't used it in years. I should have found it strange at the time. He didn't even ask for anything in return, just said I could have it for as long as I wanted. The cabin itself wasn't much. A single-story structure with faded wood siding and a sagging porch. The windows were dark, almost too dark, as if they absorbed the fading daylight instead of reflecting it. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, slinging it over my shoulder as I made my way up the steps. The wood groaned under my weight. The key was right where my cousin had said it would be, under an old ceramic planter by the door. It took some wiggling to get it into the lock, and when I pushed the door open, a stale, musty smell drifted out. The air inside was thick, untouched for what smelled like years. I flicked the light switch by the door. Nothing. I muttered a curse, already dreading the thought of fumbling around in the dark. I took out my phone, using the flashlight to scan the room. The place was small, just a living room with a stone fireplace, an old kitchen, and a short hallway leading to what I assumed was the bedroom and bathroom. There was no sign of rodents, no mess, just dust. A lot of dust. It clung to the wooden furniture, layered thick over the coffee table and countertops. I went to check the breaker box, which was in a small utility closet near the kitchen. Sure enough, the switches had all been flipped off. I reset them one by one, and the hum of electricity filled the air as the cabin slowly came to life. I went back to the living room and turned on a lamp. The warm glow pushed back some of the cabin's oppressive darkness. I dropped my bag onto the couch and sat down, rubbing my hands over my jeans. Something about this place unsettled me, but I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar setting. I got up and went to the kitchen, opening the cabinets to check for supplies. Most were empty, except for a few rusted cans of soup and some mouse-chewed pasta. I made a mental note to drive back into town tomorrow for groceries. For tonight, I had packed enough food to get by. I ate quickly, heating up a can of chili on the old gas stove. The wind outside had picked up, whistling through the trees. I could hear branches scraping against the roof, a sound that sent an unpleasant shiver down my spine. I kept the curtains open, watching the last of the daylight bleed out behind the trees. When the sky turned completely dark, I locked the door and checked the windows twice. The air had a different weight to it now, pressing against the cabin like something was out there, just beyond the tree line. I shook my head at my own paranoia and turned on the fireplace. The warmth helped, but it didn't chase away the unease curling at the edges of my thoughts. I decided to turn in early. The bedroom was small, just a single bed with a creaky wooden frame, a dresser, and an old closet that smelled like mothballs. I changed into sweats, keeping my socks on because the floor was freezing. I barely got under the covers before I heard it. A rustling sound outside, something moving through the dry leaves, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, straining my ears. Could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound wasn't random. It stopped, then started again, closer this time. I sat up, my heart pounding. The wind had died down completely, leaving nothing but silence between each rustling step. I grabbed my phone, hesitating before turning on the flashlight. If it was just an animal, I didn't want to startle it. If it wasn't, I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I slowly got out of bed and moved toward the window, standing just out of view as I listened. The sound had stopped. I swallowed hard, then tilted my head to peek outside. Nothing, just darkness and the skeletal outlines of trees. I exhaled, trying to slow my pulse. Maybe it was the wind after all. Maybe the trees were just shifting, dropping twigs and leaves. I forced myself to step back and climb into bed again. I pulled the covers up to my chin, keeping my phone close. The sound started again. Closer. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. The steps were too steady, too purposeful. My chest tightened as I realized something, or someone, was walking around the cabin. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps moved along the side of the cabin, crunching over leaves, pausing every few seconds, listening. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, loud and frantic. Then the doorknob rattled. I shot up, gripping my phone so hard my fingers ached. My mind raced. Had I locked the door? Yes, I was sure of it. But whoever was out there wasn't leaving. The knob twisted again, this time harder. I slowly, silently, slid out of bed and moved toward the closet. I didn't have a weapon, not even a knife. All I had was my phone, and I couldn't call for help. There was no signal out here. I barely had time to process my next move before I heard the sound of glass shattering. The living room window. I backed into the closet, my breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. I pushed myself into the farthest corner, my hands shaking. I could hear them inside now, heavy boots on the floorboards. The door creaked as it opened wider, letting in the cold night air. The intruder moved through the cabin slowly, as if they weren't in a rush, as if they already knew I was here. I held my breath. My mind screamed at me to run. But where? If I made a sound, they'd find me. If I stayed, I was trapped. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. A long pause. Then the door creaked open. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt, forcing myself not to make a sound. The closet door was cracked open just enough for me to see a shadow move across the room. They were standing by the bed. A long silence stretched between us. Then, finally, the shadow moved toward the window. The intruder stood there for a moment before turning and walking out. I didn't move. I didn't dare breathe until I heard the front door open and close. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Then I moved. Slowly, carefully, I pushed the closet door open. The cabin was silent. The shattered window let in a cold draft, making the curtains flutter. I grabbed my bag, not even bothering to change. I moved through the cabin as quietly as I could, stepping around the broken glass. When I reached the front door, I hesitated, listening. Nothing. I bolted. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped them. I crouched, my eyes darting around the trees, expecting to see something, someone, watching me. But there was nothing. I snatched up the keys, yanked the door open, and threw myself inside. The engine roared to life. My headlights swept over the trees as I turned the car around, gravel flying under the tires. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I never went back to that cabin. I don't know who was out there that night, and I don't want to know. All I know is that they weren't in a hurry. They weren't searching. They knew exactly where I was. I don't know how to explain what I saw that night. It still doesn't make sense. I've gone over every detail 1,000 times, trying to figure out what else it could have been. I've told myself it was just a big dog, or maybe a coyote that looked strange in the dark. But I know that's not true. It started with a weekend alone at my uncle's cabin. I'd been there plenty of times before, but always with other people. This time, I just wanted to get away from everything. No phone, no work, no noise. Just me, the lake, and the woods. The cabin was small, just one room with a wood stove and a cot pushed up against the wall. No electricity, no running water, just an old propane lantern and a pile of firewood stacked outside. It sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by thick trees on 3 sides, with a narrow path leading down to the lake. It was late September, so the air was cool, and the leaves had started to turn. Perfect weather. The first day was quiet. I fished for a while, made a small fire, and cooked some canned food. Nothing unusual. I felt comfortable out there, more at home than I did in the city. As the sun went down, I sat on the small porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. No cars, no voices, just the sound of nature. That was exactly what I wanted. I went inside when it got too cold, shut the door, and latched it. I kept the lantern low, just enough light to read by. The night was dead quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. That should have bothered me, but I didn't notice at the time. I read for a while, then crawled into the cot and pulled my sleeping bag over me. The fire in the stove crackled softly. Felt safe. Then, around midnight, I woke up. Something had pulled me out of sleep, but I didn't know what. The fire had burned down to coals, and the room was dark except for the faint glow from the stove. I held my breath, listening. First, I heard nothing, just silence. Then, from outside, a soft crunch. Footsteps. They were slow and careful, moving through the leaves just beyond the cabin. Not heavy enough to be a bear, not light enough to be a raccoon. It was something big, but trying to be quiet. I lay still, my heart pounding. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a moose, but something about the way it moved felt wrong. Too controlled, too deliberate. Another step, closer this time. I reached for the flashlight beside my cot and clicked it on, aiming it at the window. The glass was old and slightly warped, but I could see the trees outside, the clearing, the edge of the woods. Nothing. I turned it off and waited. The silence stretched on. Then, a new sound. Scraping. Right against the wall of the cabin. Not claws. Not paws. Something dragging along the wood. Slow and steady. My stomach knotted up. I sat up carefully, trying not to make noise. The lantern was still beside me, but I didn't want to light it. I didn't want whatever was out there to know exactly where I was. Then I smelled it. A thick, musky odor, like wet fur and something rotten underneath. It filled the cabin, seeping in through the cracks in the walls. I pressed my hand over my mouth, breathing through my fingers. Another scrape, this time near the door. I thought about grabbing my knife, but what good would that do? If it was a bear, the cabin was solid enough to keep it out. But I didn't think it was a bear. I didn't know what it was. A thud against the door. Not hard, just a gentle push. Then breathing. Deep, heavy breathing. Just on the other side. I stayed completely still. My whole body was tense, my ears straining. The breathing was slow and rhythmic, almost like a dog sniffing at something. But it was too loud, too deep. No dog was that big. The handle rattled. That's when I grabbed the shotgun. My uncle always kept one at the cabin, loaded with buckshot. I pulled it from under the cot and racked a shell, loud on purpose. Whatever was out there needed to hear it. The breathing stopped. For a long time, there was nothing. No movement, no sound. Just me gripping the shotgun with both hands, waiting. Then soft steps, moving away this time. Slow, careful, fading into the trees. I didn't move for a long time. I just sat there, shotgun across my lap, staring at the door. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, pale light was filtering through the window. Morning. I stood up on shaky legs and unlatched the door. The clearing looked the same as always. The trees, the path to the lake, the fire pit. Nothing seemed disturbed. Then I saw them. Tracks leading from the woods to the cabin, circling it once, then back the way they came. They weren't bear tracks. Not moose, not coyote. They were huge. Too big to be from a wolf, but shaped like one. Long claws, deep impressions, like whatever made them walked on its toes. My stomach turned. I followed them a few steps into the woods, but the thick underbrush swallowed them up quickly. I wasn't about to go deeper. I packed my things in less than 5 minutes. Didn't eat, didn't even make coffee. Just threw everything in my bag, locked up the cabin, and hiked back to my truck as fast as I could. I didn't see anything on the drive out. No animals, no movement in the trees. But the whole way, I felt like something was watching me, just out of sight, just beyond the tree line. I haven't been back to that cabin since. My uncle still goes, says he's never seen anything weird. Maybe he hasn't. Maybe whatever was out there that night was just passing through. But I'm not taking any chances. The cabin was smaller than I expected. I found it online. An old hunting lodge deep in the woods, advertised as remote and peaceful. That was exactly what I wanted. No people, no noise, no distractions. Just a week alone to clear my head. I told myself I needed the break, though Deep down, I wasn't sure what I needed. I got there late in the afternoon. The road leading up to the cabin was a mess of potholes and tree roots, and my truck barely made it. The forest was thick, pressing in from all sides. I didn't see another house for miles, which was fine by me. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that settles in your lungs. Inside, the cabin was basic but functional. A single room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, and a bed pushed against the far wall. A single window faced the trees. The walls were old wood, darkened from years of smoke. There was no electricity, just a stack of firewood and an old lantern on the counter. I set down my bag, cracked a beer, and listened to the quiet. The first night was fine. I read by lantern light until my eyes got heavy, then fell asleep to the sound of crickets. The woods were alive with little noises, branches shifting, distant owl calls, but nothing unusual. The second night, I woke up around 2 a.m., suddenly alert. I couldn't say what had woken me. The cabin was silent. The fire had died down, leaving only embers. I listened for a while, then rolled over, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as I started to drift back to sleep, I felt it. A presence. Not something I could see or hear. It was just there. A weight pressing at the edges of my thoughts. It made my skin prickle, the way you feel when someone's staring at you from across a room. I turned onto my back and stared at the ceiling, heart thudding. The air inside the cabin felt thick, like I was breathing in something heavy. I closed my eyes and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to clear my head. The sky was overcast, the woods colder than the day before. I stretched, took a piss off the side of the porch, then walked down toward a small stream I had seen on my way in. That's when I saw the tracks. Big, deep impressions in the mud near the water. Not a bear, not a wolf, something else. The shape was wrong, longer, almost human, but too large. I crouched down, touched the edge of one. The ground was still damp, fresh. I stood there for a long time, my mind refusing to make sense of it. I'd seen plenty of animal tracks before, but nothing like this. I scanned the woods, but the trees were still. The only sound was the stream trickling over rocks. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a trick of the mud, erosion from the water. But as I walked back to the cabin, that feeling returned. The pressure in my head, like something just beyond my thoughts, waiting. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it. Not a sound, not a shadow, just a feeling. A presence, close but just out of reach. My thoughts felt strange, disconnected. Memories surfaced that weren't mine. Images of snow-covered forests, the crack of breaking bones, a hunger so deep it twisted inside me like a sickness. I sat up in bed, breathing hard. My hands were shaking. It was cold, but I was sweating. I had never felt anything like it before. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, a wrongness that made my stomach churn. I decided to leave the next morning. I didn't care if I had paid for the whole week. Something was off. But when I stepped outside, I stopped. My truck. The tires were slashed, deep gashes through the rubber. I felt a cold rush of panic. An animal couldn't have done that. I hadn't seen another person for miles. I turned slowly, scanning the tree line. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Even the birds had stopped. My skin crawled. I backed up toward the cabin, keeping my eyes on the trees. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. My head throbbed, that same pressure, stronger now, like something was trying to push its way into my thoughts. Inside, I locked the door and grabbed the old hunting rifle I had found in the cabin. I checked the chamber. 2 bullets. Not much, but it was something. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, and waited. Night fell. I kept the lantern low. My ears strained for any sound. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A whisper. Not outside. Inside my head. A voice that wasn't mine. Words I didn't understand. Ancient and guttural. My body went rigid. My hands clenched the rifle so hard my knuckles turned white. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it to stop. Didn't. Memories flooded my mind. Memories that didn't belong to me. Snow, hunger, something moving through the trees, something with eyes that burned like embers. I forced my eyes open. The room was spinning. My breath came in ragged gasps. The voice was louder now, a presence inside me, pulling at the edges of my thoughts, twisting them. Then silence. And in that silence, a realization. It wasn't outside. It never had been. It was inside me. My pulse hammered. My hands felt foreign, my limbs too heavy. I tried to stand, but my body didn't feel like my own. The presence was still there, waiting. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to move, to push it back. My head pounded. It was a battle, a struggle to hold on to myself, to keep whatever this thing was from taking more. I don't remember falling asleep. When I woke up, the fire was out. The cabin was dark, cold. I sat up slowly, every muscle aching. My head felt clearer, the pressure gone. The whispering had stopped. I forced myself to my feet, moving stiffly. Dawn was breaking, pale light seeping through the trees. I stepped outside. The woods felt normal. The weight that had pressed against me for days was gone. I checked my truck again. The tires were still ruined, but I didn't care. I grabbed my bag, my rifle, and started walking. I didn't stop. I hiked for hours until I found the road, flagged down a trucker, and never looked back. I don't know what happened in that cabin. I don't want to know. All I know is this. Something was there and it tried to take me. And if I had stayed one more night, it would have. I pulled off the narrow dirt road and turned onto the overgrown path leading to my cabin. The trees were thicker than I remembered, their branches reaching out over the road, forming a tunnel that swallowed what little sunlight remained in the late afternoon. I hadn't been here in months. Life had gotten busy, and I kept putting off coming back. But now, as I drove closer, I felt that old sense of relief. This place had always been an escape, a quiet retreat where no one could bother me. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by thick woods. It wasn't much, just a single room with a loft, a wood stove, and a small porch. No electricity, no running water, just the essentials. I stepped out of my truck and stretched, taking in the silence. The air smelled damp, like earth and old wood, the way it always did after a few months of rain and neglect. Something felt off. The grass in front of the porch was flattened in places, as if someone had been walking around. I frowned. Maybe just deer, I thought. They wandered close sometimes. I grabbed my bag from the truck and headed up the steps. The door was closed, but when I reached for the handle, I noticed the lock was missing. Not broken, not forced, just gone. The hole where the deadbolt used to be gaped open. My stomach tightened. I pushed the door open slowly. The air inside was stale but carried a hint of something else. Sweat, smoke, old food. The single window let in enough light to show that things had been moved. My chair was in the wrong spot. My blankets were bunched up in the corner instead of folded on the cot, and the wood stove had fresh ashes in it. Someone had been here. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and scanned the space. My old coffee pot sat on the counter, but there was a newer, dirtier cup next to it. A can of beans rested on the shelf, half empty, a spoon still sticking out. In the corner, a pile of clothes I didn't recognize lay crumpled on the floor. A ratty sleeping bag, much dirtier than mine, was spread out beside the cot. Someone had been living here. I took a step back toward the door, scanning every inch of the room. The only sound was the wind outside, rattling the loose tin on the roof. I swallowed hard. Whoever had been staying here, were they still around? Hiding somewhere nearby? Watching me now? I grabbed the hatchet from the woodpile near the door and stepped back outside. The late afternoon light had taken on that golden hue that meant it would be dark soon. I turned in a slow circle, eyes scanning the tree line. No movement, just the wind rustling the leaves. My gut told me I wasn't alone, though. I walked around the cabin, looking for more signs. Near the back, where I kept a pile of scrap wood, I found more footprints, bigger than mine, pressed deep into the soft dirt. Someone had been moving back and forth, pacing maybe. A cigarette but lay crushed near the base of a tree. It was recent, I gripped the hatchet tighter. I didn't like this. Someone had been living in my cabin, eating my food, using my things. And they might still be nearby. I went back inside and locked the door as best as I could, wedging a chair under the handle. It wouldn't stop someone determined, but it would slow them down. I needed to think. If they came back, what would they do? Would they just leave? Or would they be angry that I'd come back? I stayed awake long after the sun set. I didn't light a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Every noise outside made my breath catch. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the wind creaking the old wood of the cabin. My hand stayed wrapped around the hatchet, ready. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off because I woke up to a noise outside. A crunch of gravel, footsteps. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps were slow, deliberate. Someone was out there. I held my breath, gripping the hatchet so tightly my knuckles ached. The steps stopped right outside the door. Silence. Then, a soft sound, metal scraping against wood. The door handle. They were trying to get in. I stayed perfectly still, forcing myself not to make a sound. The chair under the handle held, but the door creaked slightly under the pressure. The person outside let out a breath, low and frustrated. Then more silence. I don't know how long I sat there, waiting, listening. Eventually, the steps retreated. They didn't rush away. Whoever it was took their time, moving back into the trees. I waited another hour before I let myself move, my muscles stiff and aching from sitting so still. I needed to leave. Whoever had been staying here wasn't just some lost traveler. They had come back and they wanted in. I wasn't about to wait for them to try again. The first light, I packed my things. I left most of the supplies behind. I didn't want to make noise digging through shelves or moving furniture. I just took what I needed and slipped out to my truck as quietly as possible. The woods were still, too still. I felt exposed walking across the clearing, every step making me flinch. I climbed into the truck, started it up, and backed out fast. My eyes stayed on the trees, scanning for movement. I didn't see anyone, but that didn't mean they weren't there, watching. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees, too far to make out details, but close enough to know they were watching me leave. I never went back. I arrived at the cabin just before dusk, the sky already turning dark with the promise of a cold autumn night. The air smelled like damp leaves, wood smoke, and the faint scent of pine. The cabin was small, old, and set deep in the woods, far from the main road. It wasn't my first time staying here. I had come here a few times over the years, usually for a weekend of hunting or just to get away. This time I was alone. The owner of the cabin, an older man named Bill, had told me the key was under the loose plank on the porch. I found it right where he said it would be, let myself in, and locked the door behind me. Inside, the cabin was just as I remembered: wood-paneled walls, a small kitchen area, a single bedroom, and a wood stove for heat. There was no electricity, only lanterns and a few old candles. I set my bag down and checked the windows. The glass was fogging up from the temperature difference, but everything was intact. I opened one of the cabinets, found some matches, and lit a lantern. The warm light made the place feel a little less empty. The first thing I did was start a fire. The woodpile outside was dry, stacked neatly against the wall. I grabbed an armful, brought it in, and got the stove going. The flames crackled softly, filling the space with heat. It was quiet, so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. I didn't have much to do that night. My plan was simple: cook a meal, have a few drinks, and sleep early. The next morning, I'd wake up before sunrise and go hunting. I took my rifle out of its case and set it on the table. I checked the chamber, made sure everything was clean, and leaned it against the wall next to the bed. Then I went back outside to get some water from the pump. It was a bit of a walk, maybe 50 yards from the cabin, and the path was covered in dead leaves. As I walked, I felt that familiar weight of isolation pressing down on me. It wasn't fear, not exactly, just an awareness of how alone I was. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I reached the pump and started filling my bottle when I noticed something. Tracks. Not fresh, but recent. They were in the damp dirt near the base of the pump. At first, I thought they were just animal prints, maybe a deer, but as I looked closer, I saw they were too wide, too deep. Boot prints. Someone had been here. I stood there for a long moment, my ears straining for any sound in the trees around me. Nothing. Just wind. I finished filling my bottle and walked back, slower this time, scanning the area. The prints led toward the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth. I told myself it was probably just Bill or someone else who had come by recently, maybe checking on the place. But I locked the cabin door when I got back inside. Dinner was simple, canned beans and some jerky. I ate slowly, listening. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside, a branch snapping, leaves crunching, but it could have been anything. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. The lantern flickered as I sat by the fire, drinking from my flask. The warmth of the stove made me tired. I checked my rifle again, made sure the safety was off, and finally crawled into bed. I woke up sometime in the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire was still burning low in the stove, casting faint orange light across the walls. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Outside. The sound of someone stepping carefully over leaves, stopping, then moving again. My pulse pounded in my ears. I reached for my rifle without making a sound, sliding it into my hands. Then nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, gripping the rifle, staring at the door. I thought about calling out, but something in my gut told me not to. Then, a sound so quiet I barely heard it. The doorknob rattled. My breath caught in my throat. I raised the rifle, my finger hovering over the trigger. I waited. Silence. Then the footsteps started again, moving away this time. I heard them fade into the trees until there was nothing left but the crackling of the fire and my own heartbeat. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in bed, rifle in my lap, staring at the door. By morning, the woods were calm again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the world seemed normal. But when I stepped outside, my stomach turned. More footprints, right up to the door. I followed them a few yards before they disappeared into the underbrush. Whoever it was had been watching the cabin. I packed my things, fast. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw my gear into my truck, started the engine, and drove down that dirt road as fast as I could without sliding into a ditch. When I finally reached town, I stopped at a gas station, hands still shaking. I told myself it could have been some random hiker, maybe someone lost. But deep down, I knew better. They hadn't knocked. They hadn't spoken. Whoever was out there had just stood in the dark, listening, waiting. And if I hadn't woken up, I don't know what would have happened. The cabin was old. Not the cozy, rustic kind you see in travel magazines. It was the kind that looked abandoned even when people were inside it. The logs were weathered gray, the roof sagged in places, and the windows had that fogged over look like the glass had absorbed decades of cigarette smoke. I could smell the damp wood and mildew before I even stepped onto the porch. The whole place had that heavy, stale air, like no one had let fresh air in for years. I had rented it for a weekend, just a short break away from the city. I wasn't looking for anything fancy, just quiet, maybe some fishing, and no cell service. A friend had mentioned this place, said it was cheap, out of the way, and usually empty this time of year. That should have been my first clue. It was already late afternoon when I arrived. The trees around the cabin were tall and thick, the kind that seemed to absorb sound. There was no wind, no birds, just the crunch of my boots on dead leaves as I carried my bags inside. The floor creaked under my weight, and the whole place smelled like dust and something faintly rotten. Not overpowering, just enough to notice. The layout was simple. One large room with a kitchen area, a fireplace, a tiny bathroom with a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in years, a single bedroom off to the side. The bed was an old metal frame with a mattress that looked thin and stained. There were a few pieces of furniture, A wooden table, 2 chairs, a couch that looked like it had been dragged in off the side of the road. I dropped my bags near the couch and walked around. The cabin had been stocked at some point. There were canned goods in the cupboard, a pile of firewood stacked near the hearth. Someone had used it recently enough, but it still felt empty in a way I couldn't explain. Like a place no one stayed for long. I went outside to check the surroundings. The cabin sat near a lake, but not close enough for a good view. You had to walk down a narrow path through the trees to get to the water. I figured I'd do that in the morning. For now, I just wanted to get a fire going before it got too cold. I found a small axe near the woodpile. The handle was smooth and worn, the blade sharp. That was another small detail that felt strange. Everything else in the cabin looked old and neglected, but someone had cared for this axe. Someone had needed it to be sharp. The fire caught easily, filling the room with that dry, smoky warmth. I made a quick meal, just some canned beans and bread, and ate in silence. No music, no TV, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak from the walls, like the cabin was settling around me. Outside, the night came fast, the kind of dark you only get in deep woods, where there's no town nearby to cast a glow on the horizon, just blackness pressing against the windows. I stayed up for a while, staring into the fire, listening. I don't know what I expected to hear. Maybe an owl, maybe the wind picking up. But there was nothing, just the weight of the silence. Eventually, I crawled into bed, pulling the musty blankets around me, and closed my eyes. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. No sound had pulled me from sleep, no dream that I could remember. But I was awake, and something felt off. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now, and the room was cold. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a sound from outside, something moving in the leaves. Not a steady wind, not an animal scurrying. It was slow, deliberate, footsteps. I held still, barely breathing. My mind raced through possibilities. Deer? A bear? But it was too slow for an animal, too careful, like someone trying not to be heard. Then the sound stopped. I stared at the ceiling, my ears straining. Nothing, just the crackle of the dying fire. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Then there was a creak. The porch, right outside the door. I sat up, my pulse pounding in my ears. The door had a lock, a simple latch but no deadbolt. Just wood and metal between me and whatever was outside. My backpack was near the bed. I reached for it slowly, feeling for my knife. It wasn't much, a small hunting blade, just something I always carried when I went out into the woods. Silence again. I waited. 5 minutes, 10, 15, nothing. Maybe it had been the wind, maybe an animal passing through. I wanted to believe that. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, everything seemed normal. The woods looked the same, the cabin unchanged. I walked around outside, looking for tracks, but the ground was covered in leaves, and I couldn't tell if anything had been there. The day passed quietly. I hiked to the lake, fished for a while, came back and made dinner. The sky darkened. The woods fell silent again. That night, I locked the door and kept the axe next to my bed. Sometime after midnight, I woke up again. This time, there was no sound, just a feeling, that pressure in the air, like someone was standing right outside the door, watching. I sat up slowly, gripping the axe. The fire was almost out, just like the night before. The room was cold. I listened, then a sound. Not outside, inside. A soft creak. The floorboards near the kitchen. I didn't move. My eyes adjusted to the dark. The faint outline of the table, the couch. Nothing else. Then another sound. A breath. Not mine. I gripped the axe tighter, my hands sweating. The room was silent again, but I knew I wasn't alone. The door hadn't opened. The windows were shut. But something was inside with me. I swung the axe, wild, blind, hoping to hit something. The blade connected with the table, sending a sharp crack through the cabin. I jumped up, backing toward the wall, my heart hammering. Silence, then movement. A shadow near the door. A figure, I couldn't see details, just the shape of a person, standing completely still. Then they moved, slowly stepping backward. The latch lifted. The door opened. Cold air rushed in. The figure stepped outside, faded into the dark. I ran forward, slamming the door shut, bolting it with the axe wedged against the frame. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed my things and left. I didn't stop to eat, didn't look back. I told my friend about the cabin when I got back to town. Told him someone had been inside with me. He just shook his head. "No one's been up there for years," he said. "Not since the last guy disappeared." I didn't ask for details. I just made sure I never went back. I never liked cabins. Something about being deep in the woods, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence, put me on edge. But when my brother Sam asked me to help him fix up the old family cabin before he sold it, I couldn't say no. It was a 4-hour drive north, past the last gas station, down a winding dirt road with no cell service. The place hadn't been used in years. By the time I pulled up in my truck, the sun was already setting behind the trees. The cabin stood just beyond a small clearing, its wooden walls weathered and dark with age. The front porch sagged in places, and the windows were clouded with dust. The air smelled like damp wood and the faint, musty scent of rot. Sam wasn't there yet. He was supposed to meet me, but I had no way to contact him. I figured he was running late and decided to get started alone. The front door was stiff, but after a few hard shoves, it groaned open. Inside, the air was stale. The floorboards creaked under my boots, and dust floated in the dim light coming through the windows. The place hadn't changed since we were kids. Same ugly brown couch, same crooked pictures on the walls, but now it felt smaller, darker. I found a flashlight in my bag and checked the kitchen. The cabinets were mostly empty, just a few rusted cans and a broken coffee mug left behind. A thick layer of dust coated the counters. The sink, which I remembered being white, was stained brown from years of neglect. I opened the door to the back room, the one where Sam and I used to sleep during summer trips. The bunk beds were still there, but the mattresses were gone. A pile of old blankets sat in the corner, torn and covered in mouse droppings. The window at the back of the room was cracked, and the wind made it rattle against the frame. I wasn't happy about staying alone, but I had no choice. I locked the front door and dragged my sleeping bag onto the couch. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I kept the flashlight next to me, just in case. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it, something moving outside. Not the wind, not a raccoon digging through leaves. It was slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps on the porch. My body tensed. I reached for the flashlight, careful not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped. Then the doorknob rattled, just a little, like someone testing if it was locked. My heart pounded. I held my breath. The metal clicked as it turned, but the door held firm. Whoever was out there was trying to get in. I stayed completely still. My truck keys were on the counter, too far to reach without making noise. The rifle Sam kept in the cabin was somewhere in the closet, but I wasn't sure if it was even loaded. Then the footsteps moved again. Slow, heavy. They went around the side of the cabin. I turned off the flashlight and crawled toward the back room. The window, it was cracked open. I reached it just as a shadow passed by outside. I ducked down, pressing myself against the wall. The figure moved toward the window, stopping just on the other side of the glass. I could see the outline of a head, broad shoulders. Whoever it was, they were tall. Taller than me, at least. I stayed there for what felt like hours. Then, without warning, the figure stepped away. The footsteps faded into the woods. I didn't move, didn't breathe until I was sure they were gone. I barely slept after that. Every sound made my heart jump. The wind, the trees, even the old wood creaking beneath me. I waited until dawn before I moved from my spot. The first thing I did was check outside. The ground was covered in damp leaves. But there, in the dirt leading from the porch to the side window, were deep footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet. I grabbed my keys and left everything behind. I didn't care about the cabin, didn't care about fixing it up. I drove straight home, hands shaking the whole way. Sam called me the next day. He never made it to the cabin. Said his car broke down an hour away. He asked why I left so suddenly. I told him about the footprints, the door handle turning. He was quiet for a long time. Then, in a low voice, he said, "That's not the first time someone's seen them out there." He sold the cabin a week later. I never went back. I took a deep breath as I turned off the highway and onto the long, unpaved road leading to the cabin. The trees closed in around me, tall pines and bare maples stretching high, their branches tangled against the gray sky. It was late October, and the wind had a sharp bite to it. Dry leaves swirled across the gravel as I drove, the crunch of tires the only sound besides the occasional rustling in the underbrush. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A weekend alone in the woods, away from work, away from the constant noise of the city. A chance to reset. The cabin belonged to a friend of a friend, some old place their family had owned for years but rarely used. Remote, quiet, perfect. When I finally pulled up, the cabin was smaller than I expected. The wood was dark and aged, the front porch sagging a little at the edges. The single window in front was covered in dust and streaks from past rain, and the door had deep grooves in it, like something had scratched at it over time. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, along with the cooler of food, and walked up the creaking steps. Inside, the cabin was simple. A main room with a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen in the corner, and a single bedroom in the back. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly musty, like damp earth. There were no curtains on the windows, just bare glass that reflected the dimming light outside. I locked the door behind me and set my things down. The first couple of hours passed quietly. I made myself a quick meal, lit a couple of the old oil lamps, and sat by the stove with a book. The silence was thick, almost pressing. No traffic, no hum of electronics, just the occasional crack of the wood as the fire ate through it. Every now and then, I'd hear something outside, a branch snapping, leaves shifting, but I told myself it was just the wind or some animal passing through. It was around midnight when I heard the first sound that didn't sit right. A scraping noise just outside the cabin. Long and slow, like something dragging across the wood. I sat up, my breath caught in my throat, and listened. It stopped for a moment, then started again, moving along the side of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stood slowly. I didn't turn it on yet. I just stood there listening. Then, a thud, a dull, heavy sound, like something pressing against the wall. I turned on the flashlight and moved toward the nearest window, angling the beam outside. The forest looked back at me, dark and unmoving. Nothing was there. I exhaled slowly, feeling my pulse hammering in my ears. Probably a raccoon, maybe even a deer brushing up against the cabin. Still, I double-checked that the door was locked. Then I went back to the stove and sat down, but the uneasy feeling didn't leave. Sleep didn't come easy. I lay in the small bed, my ears tuned to every creak, every shift of the wind outside. Around 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly, unsure of why. The cabin was quiet, but something felt off. I turned my head toward the window. The glass was pitch black, no light from the moon or stars. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized there was something outside the window, a shape, a figure, standing right there. I froze. My body locked up completely. The shape didn't move. It was just there, pressed against the window, watching. My breath was shallow, barely making a sound. I couldn't make out details, just the outline of something human-shaped. Then slowly it moved. The shape pulled back, disappearing into the dark. I waited, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would shake the bed frame. I wanted to believe my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the dread settling deep in my stomach told me otherwise. I reached for the flashlight, gripping it so tightly my fingers ached. I knew I needed to check to make sure the doors and windows were secure. Moving as quietly as possible, I crept out of bed and into the main room. I checked the lock on the front door. Secure. I checked the windows. All closed. Then, a sound from the back of the cabin. A soft tap. Then another. I turned, my flashlight beam catching movement just outside the back window. A glimpse of something pale. A hand? I didn't wait. I grabbed my car keys from the table, threw on my boots without lacing them, and yanked the door open. Cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I sprinted to my car, the gravel slipping under my feet. I flung the door open, jumped in, and slammed the locks down. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was caving in. But then I forced myself to start the engine, my shaking hands fumbling with the keys. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the road ahead, the front of the cabin, and the figure standing at the tree line. It was just standing there, still as stone. Too far to see its face, but I could feel it watching me. I threw the car into reverse, tires skidding over the loose gravel as I backed up, then shifted into drive and tore down the road. I didn't stop. Not when I hit the highway. Not until I was miles away, where the trees thinned and I could see the lights of a gas station up ahead. I pulled in and sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, breath shaking. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back. I rented the cabin because I wanted to be alone. That was the point. A weekend off the grid. No calls, no emails. No noise except the wind through the trees and maybe the crackle of a fire. The drive out there was long, the last stretch being a narrow dirt road that wound deep into the forest. The cabin itself was simple. Wooden walls, a small porch, one bedroom, one bathroom, and a living area with a fireplace. There was no Wi-Fi, no TV, just a radio that barely picked up anything but static. That was fine. That was what I wanted. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the porch listening to the quiet. When it got too cold, I went inside and read for a while before falling asleep. I slept well, felt safe, secluded. The second night was different. I had spent the day hiking a few miles away from the cabin, and by the time I got back, the sun was already dipping below the trees. I made dinner, sat by the fire, and let myself relax. That's when I noticed something. The air had changed. It was still quiet, but not in the peaceful way it had been the night before. It was the kind of quiet where you start to feel like you're being watched. The kind of quiet that makes you listen harder. I shrugged it off. It was a remote cabin in the woods. Of course, it was quiet. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and went to bed. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't an animal. I've heard deer moving through brush before, and this wasn't that. This was slow, deliberate, heavy. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. Just the wind. I lay back down, but I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I went outside and looked around. There was nothing unusual at first, but then I saw them. Footprints in the dirt near the porch. Not mine. Too big. Too deep. They led from the tree line, stopped near the window, then turned back into the woods. Someone had been watching me. I felt sick. My first thought was to pack up and leave, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was a hunter passing through. Maybe I had just imagined hearing something last night, but I didn't believe that. I spent the day near the cabin, keeping busy with small tasks, splitting wood, straightening up inside, anything to keep my mind off the footprints. When night came, I made sure everything was locked up tight. I even dragged a chair in front of the door just in case. I didn't sleep much. Every sound made my nerves spike. The wind, the creaking of the cabin, my own breathing. It all felt too loud, too sharp. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Closer this time. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped outside the door. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, a knock. It was soft, slow, 3 deliberate raps against the wooden door. My skin went cold. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? Someone in trouble? But I knew, deep down, that wasn't it. I didn't answer. I stayed completely still. Then I heard something worse. A key. My key. Sliding into the lock. I hadn't left my key outside. It was inside on the table. My stomach dropped. Whoever was out there had another key. They turned it, tried the door, but the chair I had pushed in front of it held. The door didn't budge. I grabbed the knife from the kitchen and backed toward the bedroom. The door rattled again. The knob twisted. Then silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Then an hour. I didn't move. I stayed there until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. Then I checked the door. The key was still in the lock, stuck halfway in. But the person who had tried to get in was gone. I wanted to leave right then and there, but something in me needed to know what had happened. I circled the cabin. More footprints. This time, they led around the side of the house, past my bedroom window. And there, wedged into the wooden frame of the porch, was something I hadn't noticed before. An axe. The handle was worn, the blade dull and rusted, but it had been placed there deliberately, head down, stuck into the wood. A warning, or a message. I didn't stay to find out which. I threw my things into my bag and got into my car. The engine took too long to start, and every second felt like forever. When it finally roared to life, I sped down that dirt road, barely able to breathe. I didn't stop, not until I reached the nearest town miles away. I went straight to the police station. I told them everything. The footprints, the key, the axe. They listened, took notes, and then one of the officers asked me something that made my blood run cold. "You said the key was still in the lock?" I nodded. "Then how did they lock the door behind them?" I didn't have an answer. I still don't. The police went out to the cabin later that day. They found the axe, the footprints, even the key still in the door. But they didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. No reason for anyone to be out there. I never went back. I never even went to pick up the rest of my things. I don't know who was out there that night or how they got inside. But I do know one thing for certain. They had been in the cabin with me before I ever heard them outside. I never liked cabins. I don't know why I let myself get talked into renting one. Maybe it was the promise of peace and quiet, or maybe it was just the exhaustion of city life grinding me down until I'd agree to anything that didn't involve sirens and crowds. Either way, I had packed up my truck and driven nearly 5 hours north, deep into Ontario's backcountry, to stay in a one-room cabin by a lake. I'd planned for a week, just long enough to clear my head, maybe get some writing done, and enjoy the stillness. The cabin was old. That was my first thought when I pulled up. The wood was dark and worn, the kind that had soaked in decades of rain and sun. The porch sagged slightly, and the single window beside the door had a layer of grime that dulled the view inside. There was no lock on the door, just a simple latch. That should have been my first sign to turn around, but I told myself it was fine. I was in the middle of nowhere. Who was going to come all the way out here to bother me? The inside was basic. A small wood stove, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a rickety table with a single chair, and a counter with a few shelves above it. No electricity, no running water, just a pump outside for fresh water and an outhouse about 20 meters into the woods. It smelled like old wood and dust, but it wasn't unbearable. I dumped my bags inside, checked for any rodent droppings, and found nothing alarming. Just an old, forgotten cabin, waiting to be used. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. Back home, even in the dead of night, there was always noise. Distant traffic, people talking, the hum of my fridge. Here, the silence pressed in on me. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of trees in the wind and the faint lapping of the lake against the shore. I read by flashlight for a while, then settled into sleep. The cot was uncomfortable, but I was tired. I drifted off eventually. I woke up sometime in the night. It was pitch black, and for a moment, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. A crunch. Footsteps outside. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, my heart pounding. Could have been an animal. A deer, maybe, or a raccoon nosing around. But the steps were too steady, too purposeful. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, shining it toward the single window. The glass was too grimy to see anything clearly, just vague shapes of trees and the outline of the porch railing. I waited, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, but after a few minutes, the sound stopped. Whatever it was, it had moved on. I told myself it was nothing, my mind playing tricks on me. I forced myself to lie back down, though it took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I checked outside. The ground was soft from recent rain, and sure enough, there were tracks leading up to the porch. Not animal tracks, boots. Someone had walked right up to my door, stood there, and then left. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an old hiker passing through, maybe a park ranger. But why would they come in the middle of the night and leave without knocking? I spent the day trying to shake the unease. I went down to the lake, fished for a while, and even managed to write a few pages in my notebook. But the thought lingered in the back of my mind. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But I never did. That night, I made sure to latch the door tight. I placed my flashlight beside me and kept my boots close in case I needed to move fast. I lay there listening, waiting. Hours passed. Nothing. Just the wind, the water, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time, they didn't stop at the porch. They circled the cabin. Slow, deliberate, moving just beyond the walls, as if whoever it was knew I was inside and wanted me to hear them. My throat was dry. I held my breath, gripping the flashlight, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps stopped at the back of the cabin, near the small window by the cot. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening, then scraping, a slow, dragging sound against the wood, right beneath the window, sent a shiver through me. I wanted to look, to shine my light and see what was out there, but I was frozen. I could hear my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and took one last look at the cabin. The ground behind it was disturbed. Footprints, leading away into the trees. I didn't follow them. I didn't want to know where they led. I drove until I had cell service, then pulled over and called the rental company. I told them someone had been lurking around the cabin. They didn't sound surprised, just said they'd send someone to check it out. No apology, no concern. I never got a follow-up, never found out who it was. Maybe I didn't want to know. I haven't rented a cabin since. I was looking forward to the trip. A few days alone in a cabin, deep in the woods, away from work, away from everything. No phone calls, no emails, just silence. I needed it. I'd rented the cabin online. It was an old hunting lodge, nothing fancy, but it had what I needed. A bed, a fireplace, a small kitchen, and plenty of land around it. No neighbors, no roads close by, just trees and quiet. The drive took longer than I expected. I left in the morning, but the roads got rough. Potholes, loose gravel, twists and turns. The last few miles were just a dirt trail barely wide enough for my truck. My tires kicked up dust, and branches scraped the sides of the truck as I crawled forward. The cabin sat at the end of the trail, right where the trees opened up a little. It was smaller than I imagined, the wood dark and weathered, but it looked sturdy. The windows were small, the roof steep. A pile of firewood sat stacked against one wall. Someone had used the place recently. I parked, stretched my legs, and looked around. The forest was thick. The trees here were old, their trunks wide. The underbrush was dense, and the air smelled damp, like moss and earth. It was quiet. No wind, No birds, just the sound of my boots on the gravel as I grabbed my bag and walked up to the porch. The door was stiff but unlocked. The inside smelled like wood smoke and dust. The main room had a fireplace, a wooden table, and a few chairs. A small kitchen sat to the right, old appliances, a gas stove. A single bedroom was at the back with a narrow bed and a dresser. Simple, clean enough. I set down my bag and checked my phone. No service. I expected that, but still, it made me uneasy. I turned it off and put it in my bag. I wouldn't need it anyway. I had food, water, everything I needed. Just a few days. A break from everything. The first night was fine. I made a fire, cooked some canned soup, and sat outside on the porch as the sun set. It got dark fast out here. The kind of dark you don't get in the city. No streetlights, no glow from buildings. Just black. I heard the usual night sounds. Crickets. The occasional rustle in the underbrush. Normal stuff. At some point, I heard something bigger. Not a small animal. Something moving through the trees, slow and steady. I couldn't see anything. Just the sound. A few heavy steps, then nothing. I waited, listening, but it didn't come closer. Probably a deer. I went inside, locked the door, and went to bed. The second day was fine too. I hiked a bit, took my time. The woods were thick, easy to get lost in. I didn't go far, just enough to stretch my legs. When I got back, I chopped some firewood, cooked dinner, and sat outside again as the sun went down. That night, the sound came back. Heavy steps in the woods, closer this time. I sat on the porch, staring into the dark, but I couldn't see anything, just the sound. A few steps, then silence. Felt wrong. I don't know why, but it did. Animals don't move like that. Not stopping after every few steps. I stayed outside for a long time, waiting, but nothing happened. After a while, I went inside. Lying in bed, I heard it again. Slow, steady steps. Right outside. On the porch. I held my breath. I could hear it moving, just outside the wall. Then silence. No retreating steps. Just silence. I stayed awake for hours, waiting, but I never heard it leave. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I checked outside. Nothing. No tracks, no sign of anything. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge. I told myself that. I had 2 more nights here. I wasn't going to leave over a noise. That day, I stuck close to the cabin. Chopped more wood. Read a little. I tried to relax, but I kept thinking about the sound. When the sun started to go down, I felt it. That feeling, like I was being watched. The woods were too quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. I made a fire inside that night, locked the door, and shut the curtains. I told myself I wouldn't listen. I wouldn't let it get to me. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, coming up the porch steps. I held my breath. Then the doorknob turned. I grabbed the axe I'd brought inside earlier. My hands were sweating. The knob turned again, harder this time. Then silence. No retreating footsteps. Just silence. I didn't move. I didn't sleep. The sun came up, and I packed my things. I didn't care if I had another night left. I was done. I stepped outside, gripping the axe, and checked around. No tracks, no signs, but I wasn't staying. I threw my bag in the truck and got in. The engine started, and I felt a wave of relief. I backed up, turned onto the dirt road, and started driving. A mile down, I glanced in the mirror. There was a man standing in the trees, not moving, not hiding, just standing there watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept driving, faster than I should have, bouncing over potholes, tearing through branches. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I made it back to the main road and didn't stop until I was home. I didn't call the police. What would I say? There was no proof. Just footsteps, just a feeling. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. Someone was out there. Someone was watching me. And I don't think I was the first. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset, my truck rumbling up the gravel driveway. the crunch of tires on stone the only sound for miles. It had taken me nearly 5 hours to get here, deep in the woods, far from cell towers and highways. That was the whole point, to get away from everything for a while. Work had been relentless, and I needed space, quiet, time to think. The cabin wasn't much, just a small one-room structure with a loft for sleeping, a wood stove in the corner, and a kitchen that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. No running water, just a hand pump outside, and no electricity beyond a small solar panel for the basics. I'd stocked up on food and brought extra firewood, knowing the October nights up here could be brutally cold. I killed the engine, grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, and stepped out. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the woods stretched endlessly around me. No other cabins, no roads in sight, just trees and the narrow dirt path that had brought me here. I unlocked the door, pushing it open with my shoulder. The inside smelled of dust and old wood, but it was dry and solid. Setting my bag down, I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension that still clung to me. This was supposed to be relaxing. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. The first couple of hours passed easily. I lit a fire in the wood stove, unpacked my supplies, and sat on the front porch, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the trees. There was a stillness here I wasn't used to. No traffic, no voices, just the occasional rustling in the underbrush and the wind moving through the pines. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A sharp, distant snap. A branch breaking somewhere out in the woods. I froze, listening. The sound was far off, but distinct. Not just a branch falling on its own. Something had stepped on it. I told myself it was nothing. A deer, maybe. A raccoon. But a feeling settled into my stomach, heavy and cold. The woods were dark now, and I couldn't see past the porch. I had a flashlight in my bag, but I didn't want to use it. Shining a light into the dark felt like asking for something to look back. I forced myself to move, going inside and shutting the door. Felt safer that way. I locked it, stoked the fire, and told myself to stop being stupid. By the time I got into bed, the feeling hadn't gone away. The wind had picked up, making the trees groan, branches scraping against the roof. I lay in the loft, staring at the dark ceiling, listening. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Another snap, a slow, deliberate step. The cabin had one small window just above the bed. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. I turned my head, staring at the blackness outside, waiting for something to move. Nothing did, but I knew something was out there. I barely slept, jerking awake at every sound. The wind, the settling of the cabin, the faint creak of a tree swaying too hard. Every noise felt wrong, like it was coming from something just outside, but nothing ever happened. By morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. Too much time in the city had left me jumpy. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and tried to relax. The forest felt different in daylight, less threatening. Birds called from the trees, and I saw a few squirrels darting through the underbrush. Normal, completely normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling from the night before. I spent the day hiking, trying to distract myself. There was a small lake a couple miles from the cabin, clear and still, the kind of place you'd see in a postcard. I sat there for a while, watching the water, the way the trees reflected in it. I didn't hear anything behind me, didn't see anything move, but the feeling came back, like I was being watched. I turned, scanning the woods, my pulse picking up, but there was nothing, just trees, thick and unmoving. The hike back felt longer. Every crack of a branch made me spin around. Every rustle in the leaves made me grip the small knife in my pocket. I told myself I was being paranoid. When I got back to the cabin, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were in the dirt just outside the porch, leading up to the door. Heavy, deep impressions like someone had stood there for a long time. I felt a rush of cold through my body, staring at them. They weren't animal tracks. They weren't from my boots. Someone had been here, standing right at my door. I looked around, heart hammering. The woods were still, the sunlight filtering through the trees. No sign of anyone. No sign of where they'd gone. I went inside fast, locking the door behind me. I checked my bag, my supplies. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been touched. I grabbed my hunting knife, gripping it tight. My mind was racing. How long had they been there? Had they watched me leave? Were they watching me now? I stayed inside the rest of the day, only stepping out once to grab more firewood. I kept checking the trees, waiting to see something move, but nothing did. That night, I barely slept. I sat by the wood stove, knife in my lap, ears straining for any sound. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Slow, deliberate steps, right outside the cabin. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. The door handle rattled. Not the wind, not an animal. Someone was trying to get in. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The handle jiggled again, harder this time. I gripped my knife, heart pounding. The door was locked, but how long would that stop them? Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep at all after that. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I grabbed my bag, threw everything into the truck, and got the hell out of there. I didn't look back. I drove until I reached the nearest town, pulling into a gas station, hands shaking as I filled up. I told myself I'd been imagining things, that it was nothing, but I knew better. Someone had been out there, and they had been watching me, and if I had stayed one more night, I don't think I would have made it out. The drive up took longer than I expected. The roads were narrow, winding through thick forest, the kind of place where you don't see another car for miles. I had rented the cabin for the weekend, just a break from everything. Work, people, the constant buzz of my phone. A few days in the quiet sounded perfect. The cabin itself was small, tucked deep in the woods, away from any neighbors. The listing had said it was rustic but comfortable, which meant there was no Wi-Fi and barely any cell service. That was fine. I wasn't here for that. I parked in front, grabbed my bag from the trunk, and went up the porch steps. The cabin smelled of wood and dust, like it hadn't been used in a while. The furniture was old but sturdy. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom with a queen-sized bed. No TV, just a few shelves of books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. I set my bag down and went to check the locks. The front door had a thick, metal bolt. The back door, leading to a tiny porch and more endless trees, had a similar lock. The windows were shut tight. Satisfied, I set about making the place feel a little less empty. I lit the old oil lamp on the kitchen table, cracked open a beer, and sat on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest as the sun started to set. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that city people forget exists. No hum of traffic, no voices, just the rustling of trees, the occasional chirp of a bird. It should have been relaxing, but something about it put me on edge. Maybe it was just the isolation, the fact that there wasn't another soul around for miles. Or maybe it was how quickly it got dark. One second the sky was a deep orange, the next it was nearly black. No streetlights out here, just the moon and the stars, which were barely visible through the dense trees. I finished my beer and went inside. I made sure the doors were locked again before heading to bed. The bed was stiff, the blankets smelled a little musty, but it would do. I turned off the lamp and lay there, listening. Something about the silence felt wrong. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. New places always felt weird the first night. I closed my eyes, focusing on the steady sound of my own breathing. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. I sat up immediately. Could have been anything. A deer, a raccoon. But then I heard another sound. Footsteps, slow, careful, moving through the trees behind the cabin. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, then started again, closer this time. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and moved to the window. It was pitch black outside. Even with my eyes adjusted to the dark, I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped. I stayed by the window, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe I was being paranoid. I climbed back into bed. But I didn't sleep. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The sun was filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the floor. I got up, stretched, and went to make coffee. Maybe last night had just been my imagination. But when I stepped out onto the porch, my stomach dropped. There were footprints in the dirt. Not boot prints, bare feet. They led from the trees to the back of the cabin. They stopped just under the bedroom window. I swallowed hard. My mind immediately started coming up with explanations. Maybe a hiker had gotten lost. Maybe it was some drunk camper wandering through the woods. But the thing was, the footprints didn't go back into the trees. Whoever had stood outside my window hadn't left. I spent the next few hours convincing myself it was nothing, just some weird coincidence. But as the day stretched on, that feeling of being watched never left. Every time I stepped outside, I felt eyes on me. Every time I went inside, I found myself checking the locks over and over again. By the time the sun started to set, I was exhausted. But I wasn't about to sleep in the bedroom, not with that window. Instead, I pulled the couch closer to the front door, where I could keep an eye on it. I set a fire in the fireplace and kept the poker within arm's reach. I stayed awake as long as I could, but eventually sleep won. I woke up to a sound, something tapping against the cabin wall. My heart pounded. I didn't move, just listened. The sound came again, a light, deliberate tap. Then, a second sound, the creak of the porch steps. I gripped the poker and sat up slowly. The fire had burned down to embers. The room was dark, except for the faint glow from the coals. The front door was locked. The windows were shut, but someone was outside. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. Silence. Then, the doorknob rattled. I gripped the poker tighter. The rattling stopped, but I could hear something shifting outside, moving, and then a slow scraping sound. Fingernails, dragging down the wooden door. I had enough. I stood, heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. I flicked it on and aimed it through the window beside the door. Nothing. The porch was empty. The trees beyond were still. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could, yanked it open, and shined the flashlight out. The footprints were back. They led from the tree line to the door. But again, no prints leading away. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My hands were shaking. My mind raced through my options. I could leave, but that meant walking to my car in the dark, through the trees. No, I wasn't doing that. I stayed up until dawn, gripping the fireplace poker like my life depended on it. When the sun finally rose, I threw my bag together, rushed outside, and practically ran to my car. The footprints were gone, but as I yanked open the car door, I noticed something scratched into the wood of the cabin, right next to the doorframe. One word: stay. I didn't. I drove until I hit the highway, until the trees thinned out, until I saw other cars. Only then did I breathe again. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't want to know, but I do know one thing. I'll never go back. I don't know why I even agreed to it. Maybe I just wanted a break from everything. A weekend alone in a cabin sounded nice when I first heard the idea. The owner, some guy my coworker knew, rented it out cheap because it was deep in the woods and didn't have much in the way of modern conveniences. I didn't care. I wanted quiet, space, and some time to clear my head. I didn't think much about the fact that I'd be completely alone. The drive was long, about 5 hours north. Most of it was spent on winding back roads, with the last 45 minutes on a narrow dirt road full of potholes. No cell service. I wasn't expecting any, but it still felt unsettling when I saw the signal bars disappear for good. My truck bounced over the rough ground, tires kicking up dust as I kept one hand tight on the wheel. Trees pressed in on both sides, thick and endless. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, The place looked just like I expected. A single-story wooden structure with a small porch, a metal roof, and a stone chimney. It sat on the edge of a lake, still and dark, surrounded by towering trees. The air smelled damp, like old wood and earth. A small dock jutted out into the water, a rowboat tied to its side. No other cabins in sight. No distant hum of traffic. Just silence. I cut the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the nothingness. No wind, no birds, no insects, just dead quiet. I grabbed my bag, my cooler, and my rifle before heading inside. The door was stiff, the wood swollen from years of moisture, but it finally gave way with a groan. Inside was exactly what you'd expect from an old hunting cabin. A small kitchen area with a propane stove, an old table with 2 chairs, and a sitting area with a couch that looked older than me. A wood-burning stove stood against one wall, and in the back, there was a single bedroom with a cot and a thin mattress. The walls were covered in mounted deer heads and yellowed photographs. A few dusty books sat on a shelf next to a lantern and a box of matches. I unpacked quickly. The sun was setting, and I wanted to get a fire going before it got too dark. I stepped outside, grabbing a few logs from the covered woodpile near the porch. That's when I noticed it. A set of boot prints dried in the mud near the stairs. They weren't mine. Too large, too deep, and they led away from the cabin toward the tree line. I stared at them for a long moment, my stomach twisting. Could have been the owners, I told myself. Maybe the last renter. Maybe just old prints from weeks ago. Still, I looked over my shoulder more than once as I brought the wood inside. That night, I sat by the wood stove, listening to the fire crackle. I had a book open in my lap, but I wasn't reading it. The quiet was pressing in too hard. It wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. I could hear every creak of the old wood, every shift of the wind against the cabin walls. And then I heard something else. A single, steady footstep on the porch. I froze, the hairs on my arms rising. I waited, barely breathing. Another step. A slow, deliberate movement of weight on the old boards. Someone was out there, standing just beyond the door. I reached for my rifle, careful not to make a sound. My pulse pounded in my ears. I waited, staring at the door, watching for the knob to turn, for a shadow to pass across the window. But nothing happened. The sound stopped. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I stayed like that for nearly an hour, rifle in my lap, my back pressed against the arm of the couch. My eyes burned from not blinking enough. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe an animal had wandered onto the porch. Maybe an old board had settled. I barely slept. Every little noise jolted me awake. By the time the sun crept through the curtains, I felt like I hadn't closed my eyes at all. I stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, scanning the tree line. Nothing. But then I looked down at the wood beneath my feet. A fresh boot print, clear as day, right where I had heard the sound the night before. The print was deep, pressed hard into the damp surface of the porch, right near the door. Someone had been standing there, listening, watching. I swallowed hard, packed my bag, loaded my rifle. I had planned to stay 2 nights, but I wasn't stupid. I didn't care if I had paid for the weekend. I wasn't going to be here when the sun set again. I locked the door behind me and started toward my truck, scanning the woods with every step. The engine roared to life, and I threw it into reverse, spinning gravel as I backed onto the dirt road. My hands were shaking. My gut was tight. I felt exposed, like eyes were on me from the shadows of the trees. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the road about 50 yards ahead. Just standing there, half hidden behind the trees. I couldn't make out details, but I could see the shape of a person. Too tall and broad to be anything else. Just standing there, watching me leave. I slammed my foot on the gas, speeding past, heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't look back. I didn't slow down. I drove 5 hours straight without stopping, without checking my phone, without turning on the radio. I never found out who it was. Never found out how long they had been watching. But I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone in that cabin. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. A few days away from everything, alone in a cabin deep in the woods, just me and the quiet. I had rented the place online. An old, small hunting cabin a few hours north of where I lived. The pictures made it look decent, rustic but comfortable. The owner assured me it was stocked with firewood and had a working stove, and that was all I needed. The drive was long, mostly on winding back roads that turned into rough gravel the farther I went. I lost service about 20 minutes before I reached the cabin. The last stretch of road was barely more than a trail through the trees, but the cabin was there, just like in the pictures. It sat in a small clearing, a narrow porch wrapping around the front, a chimney rising from one side. There were no other cabins nearby, no signs of people, just endless forest stretching out in every direction. I parked my truck and climbed out, stretching my legs. The place smelled like pine and damp earth. It was late afternoon, and the sun was already starting to drop behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. I hauled my bag inside, checked out the small kitchen, the single bedroom, the wood-burning stove. Everything seemed fine, a little musty but fine. I got a fire going in the stove and set up for the night. The first night was uneventful. I sat on the porch for a while, listening to the wind move through the trees. The forest felt different out here, heavier. The silence wasn't complete. There were the occasional rustlings of small animals, the distant call of an owl, but it felt off, like the trees were holding their breath. I shook the feeling off and went inside when it got too cold. I slept fine, only waking up once when I thought I heard something moving outside, but it was probably just a deer or a raccoon. The second day, I spent most of my time exploring the woods. I followed a narrow, overgrown trail that led deeper into the forest, past thick clusters of trees and moss-covered rocks. I found an old, broken-down hunting blind, its wood rotting and sagging. I found a creek, its water clear and ice-cold. I didn't see another person all day. It was perfect. That night, I built a small fire in the fire pit outside and cooked dinner. The woods felt even quieter than the night before. I kept feeling like I was being watched. Every time I turned toward the trees, there was nothing there, just darkness and the vague outlines of branches shifting in the wind. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was too quiet, that was all. I went inside, locked the door, and settled in. The fire in the stove crackled softly. I read for a while by lantern light, but I couldn't focus. That feeling wouldn't go away. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see something staring back at me. I finally forced myself to lie down, pulling the blankets up to my chin, and shut my eyes. I woke up to the sound of something scratching against the cabin wall. It wasn't loud. A slow, dragging sound, like claws against wood. I held my breath and listened. It stopped. A few seconds passed, then it came again, closer this time. My stomach clenched. It sounded like it was right outside the bedroom wall. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make any noise. My heart pounded against my ribs. I clicked the light on and shone it at the window. Nothing, just the trees and the darkness beyond them. The scratching stopped. I waited, straining to hear any other sounds. Nothing. I forced myself to relax. Maybe a branch had been scraping against the wall in the wind. Maybe a raccoon. I shut the flashlight off and tried to go back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to check. There were marks on the cabin wall. Deep, parallel grooves running down the wood, like something had dragged its claws along it. My stomach twisted. No raccoon had done that. I looked around the clearing. The ground was mostly hard-packed dirt and dead leaves, but near the edge of the trees, I found tracks. They weren't normal. They looked almost like dog tracks, but too big. The pads were wide, the claws long, pressing deep into the dirt. But the strangest part was the shape. It looked like whatever had left them had been walking on two legs. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my skin crawling. A bear, maybe, but bear tracks didn't look like this. And besides, the scratches on the wall were too deliberate, too precise. My gut told me whatever had done this had been watching me. I spent most of the day inside. I kept my rifle close, listening to every creak of the cabin, every rustling of the trees. By the time the sun started going down, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to find out. I packed up my things, keeping my rifle loaded and within reach. I waited until the last bit of daylight was slipping away before heading to my truck. The forest felt suffocating. The air was thick, heavy. Every step I took felt too loud. I reached the truck, threw my bag in the back, and yanked the door open. Then I smelled it. A thick, musky stench like wet fur and rotting meat. My stomach turned. I turned my head, slowly, and looked toward the tree line. Something was standing there. It was tall, too tall. The shape was wrong. A hunched figure, its back arched, its limbs too long. The last light of the sun caught its eyes, reflecting back like an animal's. Its head was shaped like a dog's, but the mouth was too wide, the teeth too long. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I moved without thinking, jumping into the truck and slamming the door. My hands were shaking so bad I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life and I slammed my foot on the gas. Gravel spun beneath the tires as I shot forward, the headlights cutting through the trees. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I just kept driving, pushing the truck as fast as I could down that narrow road, not slowing until I saw the first sign of civilization. I didn't stop until I was hours away. I pulled into a gas station, parked under the bright lights, and just sat there, shaking. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had seen. But there was no explanation that made sense. I never went back to that cabin. I never told anyone the full story. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that thing standing at the edge of the trees, watching. I wonder how long it had been there before I noticed. And I wonder if it ever followed me home. I never liked the idea of being out in the woods alone, but after everything that had been going on back home, I needed some time away. I found an old rental listing for a cabin deep in the woods of northern Ontario. It was cheap, isolated, and supposedly had a great view of the lake. I packed up for the weekend, figuring some quiet time away from everything would be exactly what I needed. The drive was long, nearly 6 hours from the city. The roads became narrower the deeper I went, eventually turning into a single-lane dirt road winding through thick pine forest. My cell service dropped about an hour before I arrived. There was no signal, no bars, just trees and the sound of gravel crunching beneath my tires. I told myself it was fine. People used to go without cell phones all the time. I'd have a few days of peace, then head back to normal life. The cabin was smaller than I expected, but it looked sturdy. Dark wood siding, a slanted metal roof, and a small porch with an old rocking chair. The forest surrounded it on all sides except for one clearing that overlooked the lake. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs. The air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth. It was quiet, too quiet. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the occasional rustling of leaves. Inside, the cabin was basic but clean. A small kitchen with an old propane stove, a tiny bathroom with a metal sink, and a single bedroom with a creaky wooden bed frame. A wood stove sat in the corner, and next to it was a stack of logs. The windows were small, with heavy curtains that looked like they hadn't been moved in years. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, nothing modern except for a single battery-powered lantern hanging by the door. I spent the first few hours settling in, unloading my bags and stacking the firewood inside just in case. The temperature dropped fast in these woods at night. By the time the sun started setting, the lake turned glassy and dark. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees but nothing more. I made a simple dinner, ate in silence, and listened to the sounds of the forest. It wasn't until later that I started noticing little things. At first, it was small, a branch cracking somewhere in the woods, heavier than what a squirrel or rabbit would make. Then came the feeling, that weird sensation like someone was watching me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I wasn't used to the silence. Still, I kept checking the windows, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line. I went to bed early, but sleep didn't come easy. The bed was uncomfortable, and every little sound outside made my heart pound. I kept thinking about bears, about wolves, about things that could easily kill me out here if they wanted to. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard it. A noise outside. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. Slow, steady footsteps on the porch. I held my breath. The steps stopped just outside the door. I didn't hear knocking, just silence. My pulse throbbed in my ears. Then the rocking chair creaked. One slow, steady movement, back and forth, back and forth. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. The chair stopped creaking, and everything was silent again. I don't remember falling asleep, but at some point, I did. When I woke up, the sun was already up, and everything felt normal, like I had imagined it. Maybe the wind had moved the chair. Maybe I was just spooked from being alone. I stepped outside, looking around. The chair was slightly tilted, facing the door instead of the lake. That wasn't right. I would have noticed that before. I looked at the ground. There were footprints in the dirt. Large, heavy ones leading from the woods to the porch. I felt sick. Someone had been here, watching me. I grabbed my keys and made the split-second decision to leave, but as I reached my car, I saw it. The back tire was slashed. A long, deep cut through the rubber. My heart pounded. I was stuck. I tried to think. There was a small town about 10 miles back, but walking that far through dense forest wasn't an option. I checked my trunk, found a spare, and worked as fast as I could to change it. My hands were shaking the entire time. By the time I finished, the sun was starting to set again. I threw my bags in the car, ready to leave. Then I saw something move in the tree line. A figure, tall, unmoving, just standing between the trees. I couldn't see the face, just the outline. I didn't wait. I jumped in the car, started the engine, and tore down the dirt road without looking back. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, until I saw streetlights and other cars. I pulled over at a gas station, my hands still shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I didn't know who was out there, what they wanted, or how long they had been watching me. But I knew one thing: I would never go back to that cabin. Never. I drove up the winding dirt road, tires crunching over loose gravel. The trees thick on both sides, dark and dense. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine, that deep earthy scent of the woods after a recent rain. I was alone, the only car on the road, which made sense. The cabin was remote, far enough from the main roads that I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The isolation was part of the appeal, at least at first. The cabin belonged to an old friend's uncle, who'd offered to let me use it for the weekend. No service out there, he'd warned me, but there's a landline if you need it. I had nodded, thinking a few days without my phone buzzing would be nice. A break from work, from the city, from everything. Now, as I pulled up to the small, single-story wooden cabin, the feeling was different. The isolation pressed in a little more than I expected. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs. The trees swayed slightly in the wind, making a quiet, rustling sound. The cabin was simple: log walls, a steep roof, a porch with an old rocking chair that moved slightly in the breeze. I grabbed my bag from the back seat and went up the wooden steps. The key was under the mat, just like I'd been told. Inside, the air was cool and still. Dust hung in the beams of sunlight coming through the windows. The furniture was old but sturdy: a couch with worn cushions, a small dining table, a wood-burning stove. The landline sat on a small table near the front door. I tested it. A dial tone buzzed in my ear. Good. I spent the first hour settling in, unpacking my food into the small fridge, setting my sleeping bag on the bed in the single bedroom. As the sun lowered, I sat on the porch, sipping a beer, watching the trees. It was peaceful, too peaceful. The kind of quiet that feels unnatural when you're used to constant noise. I kept catching myself listening for something, anything, but there was nothing except the occasional creak of the trees and the faint sound of water from a nearby creek. As it got dark, I went inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin had no Wi-Fi, no TV, so I read for a while by lantern light. The wind had picked up, making the trees outside groan. Then I heard something else. A sound just barely different from the wind. A soft crunch like footsteps on leaves. I held my breath, listening. It was gone. Probably an animal, I told myself. A raccoon, maybe a deer. I shook it off and went back to my book. A few minutes later, another sound. A light tap, tap, tap against the side of the cabin. Not wind, not an animal. Something deliberate. I stood up, heart thudding. The rocking chair on the porch creaked again, but this time there was no wind. I moved to the window, careful not to stand directly in front of it. Through the glass, I saw only darkness. The trees, the porch, the empty chair. Then another sound. A low, muffled exhale. Close. Too close. I reached for my phone before remembering. No service. The landline. I moved carefully to it, lifting the receiver, pressing it to my ear. Silence. No dial tone. Just silence. A slow, creeping fear spread through me. I put the phone down carefully and moved toward the kitchen, where a drawer held a heavy flashlight and a long hunting knife. I gripped both and stood still, listening. The sounds had stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, standing in the dim light of the lantern, knife in hand, breath shallow. Nothing, just my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination, nerves getting the best of me. I locked the bedroom door behind me and lay in bed, the knife still within reach. I must have dozed off because I woke up suddenly, my body alert before my mind caught up. Then I heard it, the sound of the front door handle turning. Slow, careful. I barely breathed. The lock held, but the handle jiggled again. A long pause, then a faint creak of wood, as if someone had stepped onto the porch, shifting their weight. Another pause, then footsteps, moving away this time, soft, deliberate. I didn't move until the first light of dawn. When I finally got the courage to open the door, stepping onto the porch, everything looked the same, except for the dirt in front of the steps. Footprints, not boots, bare feet, leading from the trees to my door, and then back again. I drove up the winding road, my tires crunching over loose gravel as the trees on either side thickened, swallowing the road behind me. The rental cabin was deep in the woods, far from the highway, exactly how I wanted it. A week alone, no distractions, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. The drive had taken longer than expected. It was already late afternoon by the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood. It was an old structure, wooden and weathered, but sturdy. A front porch with a single rocking chair faced the thick woods. The trees were so dense they almost looked like a wall. Beyond them, the sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the ground. I stepped out of my truck, stretching after the long drive. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I grabbed my bag and walked up the short set of steps to the front door. The key was exactly where the owner had said it would be, under the rusted lantern hanging beside the door. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, the hinges groaning. Inside, the cabin was simple. A living area with a couch and a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen with an old fridge, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed frame and a thin mattress. Everything smelled like wood and dust. I set my bag down and walked through the place, checking the windows, making sure they all locked. The back door led to a small, overgrown yard, nothing but trees beyond it. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cabin grew darker, and I switched on the old lamps scattered around the rooms. They cast a yellow glow, barely enough to chase away the deepening shadows. The silence settled in, heavy and absolute. There was no distant hum of traffic, no voices, no neighbors, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling, the wind against the windows. That first night, I sat on the porch for a while, drinking a beer and staring into the woods. It was peaceful at first, the kind of silence that felt untouched. But as the darkness deepened, I became aware of just how alone I was. Every small sound, a twig snapping, leaves rustling, made me glance toward the trees. I slept lightly, waking up at every noise. Sometime in the night, I heard something moving outside. It was slow, deliberate, not the scurry of a small animal. Something heavier. I lay still, listening. Footsteps. Not quite human, not quite animal. A weird in-between. The next morning, I stepped outside, searching the dirt around the porch. There were tracks. Not boots, not hooves. Bare feet. Long toes, wide set. They led from the trees to the cabin, stopping just beneath the porch before retreating back into the woods. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Maybe some hunter, some drifter. I tried to shake it off. I spent the day hiking, trying to push the thought from my mind. The woods were vast, stretching for miles. I followed an old trail, listening to the birds, the distant sound of a woodpecker knocking against a tree. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. No wind, no animals, just silence. I turned back sooner than I had planned. The cabin felt safer even with those footprints. But that night, the sounds came again. Closer this time. I didn't move, just lay there listening. The steps came up onto the porch. A slow, deliberate weight pressing into the old wood. I held my breath. Then, the creak of the rocking chair moving, slow and steady, as if someone had sat down. I wanted to look, but I couldn't. I just stayed there, heart hammering. After what felt like an eternity, the chair stopped moving. The footsteps retreated. Morning came and I forced myself onto the porch. The chair was slightly off from where it had been. More footprints leading to the trees. I had one more night in the cabin. I should have left right then, but I didn't. The last night I barricaded the door. I sat awake with my flashlight and a knife, staring at the door, the windows. Around midnight, the sounds returned. Footsteps, then a slow, dragging sound, something heavy being pulled along the porch. A soft, almost human breathing just beyond the door. Then the doorknob turned. I didn't breathe. The knob rattled harder. Then a long silence. I thought, for a moment, it was over. But then the knocking started. Not loud, just soft, steady knocks over and over. I stayed there until the sun came up. The knocking had stopped sometime before dawn. When I finally forced myself to check the porch, my stomach turned. A deer carcass, half rotted, lay stretched across the porch steps. Its ribs were cracked open, its insides scooped clean. I packed my things and left without looking back. I never found out who or what had been out there, and I never went back. I was looking forward to the quiet. A week alone in a cabin deep in the woods. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through the pines. No traffic, no people, no noise, just peace. I had rented the place online, some off-grid cabin listed by an older couple who lived miles away. They gave me the directions over email, told me there was no cell service out there, but assured me the place had everything I needed. Wood for the stove, fresh water from a nearby stream, and plenty of food stocked up. Sounded perfect. The drive took me deeper than I expected, further off paved roads and onto twisting dirt trails. The deeper I went, the more the trees seemed to close in. I didn't pass a single house or vehicle for miles. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I felt a strange sort of relief, like I had made it through some kind of threshold. The cabin itself was small but sturdy, built of thick logs and tucked between tall pines. The windows were small, just two in the front, with heavy wooden shutters. There was a single door, thick and old, with a heavy iron latch. A woodshed sat to the side, stacked full, and a narrow path led off toward what I assumed was the stream. Everything looked well-maintained but old, like it had been standing there for generations. I stepped out of my truck and stretched, taking in the crisp autumn air. It was so quiet, not even birds, just the wind moving through the trees. I spent the first day settling in, checking the place out. The inside was simple, a main room with a wood stove, a table, and a few chairs. A small kitchen area with an old propane stove, a sink with a pump, and shelves lined with canned food. A single bedroom with a narrow bed and an old dresser. The bathroom was an outhouse a short walk from the cabin, down a path lined with pine needles. It was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. That night, as I sat by the stove, the wind picked up, making the trees sway and groan. I wasn't nervous, but I was aware of how alone I was. The closest town was nearly 40 miles away. If something happened, I was on my own, but that was part of the appeal. I wanted to test myself, to feel that kind of isolation. It started the second night. A sound outside. I was reading by lantern light when I heard it. Something moving just beyond the cabin. It wasn't the wind. It was a steady, deliberate crunch of leaves and twigs. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. I put the book down and listened, my heartbeat picking up. I had locked the door. The shutters were closed, but I felt exposed, like whatever was out there could see me through the cracks. I waited, barely breathing. The sound moved around the cabin, slow, circling. I stood and grabbed the rifle I had brought with me, not because I expected to need it, but because I didn't like the way my gut felt. My fingers were tight around the stock as I listened. The footsteps stopped by the back of the cabin, near the woodshed. I waited, every muscle tense. Then silence. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only minutes. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe a bear, nothing to worry about. I went back to the chair but kept the rifle close. It took me a long time to fall asleep, and when I did, I dreamed of something watching me from the trees. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from the night's mist, the leaves dark and heavy. I expected to see tracks, deer maybe, but what I saw made my stomach drop. Footprints, bear, human. They circled the cabin, pausing at the door, the windows, the woodshed. I stared at them, my breath tight in my throat. I wasn't alone out here. I checked around, but there was no sign of anyone. No campsites nearby, no trails leading away, just those footprints in the damp earth. I tried to shake it off. Maybe some hiker got lost. Maybe it was someone from the nearest town. Maybe they saw the cabin, got curious, and left when they realized someone was inside. I told myself that, but I didn't really believe it. That night, I locked the door and bolted the shutters. I kept the rifle beside me, loaded. The fire burned low, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. I tried to sleep but couldn't. I just lay there listening. Then, around midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, gripping the rifle. The footsteps circled, then stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing. Low, slow. Too controlled to be an animal. I wanted to call out, to demand who was there, but something in me said not to. It was the same feeling you get when you're a kid, hiding under the covers because you know if you look, you'll see something you don't want to see. The breathing stopped, then a scratching sound, like fingernails on wood. The latch rattled. I raised the rifle, my hands sweaty. The scratching continued, slow and methodical. Then something spoke. My voice. It was me, my own voice, whispering from the other side of the door. Let me in. Every hair on my body stood up. It wasn't an echo. It wasn't a recording. It was speaking clear just like I would. The exact tone, the exact pitch. Let me in. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind was screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The woods were black, endless. The only thing between me and whatever was outside was that door. The whispering stopped. The footsteps moved away, slow, then faster until they were gone. I didn't sleep. I sat there until the sun rose, gripping the rifle so tight my hands ached. When daylight finally came, I went outside, heart pounding. The footprints were there, circling the cabin, stopping at the door. I packed my things, fast. I didn't care about the rest of the week. I didn't care about the money. I threw everything in the truck and started the engine. As I pulled out of the clearing, I glanced at the woodshed. The door was open. Inside, deep in the shadows, something moved. Not fast, just a small, shifting motion. like something was stepping back into the dark. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I drove fast, not caring about the potholes, not caring about anything but putting as much distance as I could between me and that place. When I finally reached town, I stopped at a gas station, hands still shaking. The attendant, an older man, looked at me as I fumbled for cash. "Stay at the old cabin?" he asked. I looked at him, heart still pounding. His eyes were knowing. "You're not the first." I got to the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to slip behind the trees. It wasn't much, just a small, one-room place my uncle had built years ago, deep in the woods where there was nothing but trees, dirt, and silence. I needed the silence. A few days alone, away from everything. No cell service, no people, just me and the quiet. The cabin sat near a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. A creek ran about 50 yards downhill, and there was an old fire pit out front, filled with the charred remains of past fires. I dropped my bag on the porch, unlocked the door, and stepped inside. It smelled like wood, dust, and the faintest hint of old smoke. The furniture was simple, just a small table, a chair, a narrow bed in the corner. There was a wood stove against one wall and a stack of firewood beside it. It wasn't luxury, but it was enough. I spent the first hour getting settled. I unpacked my food, filled the water jug from the creek, and made sure the lanterns had enough fuel. Then I stepped outside to gather some more firewood before it got dark. The air was still, the kind of stillness you only find deep in the woods, where even the wind has a hard time slipping through the trees. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves. I walked a little farther than I probably should have, collecting fallen branches and splitting some smaller logs with my hatchet. When I finally turned back toward the cabin, the sun was almost gone. The shadows stretched long across the ground, and the trees seemed closer than before. I picked up my pace, suddenly aware of how alone I was out here. Back at the cabin, I started a fire in the wood stove. The warmth filled the small space quickly, chasing away the slight chill in the air. I cooked a simple meal, ate in silence, then sat on the porch for a while, listening. I could hear the creek running in the distance, the occasional rustle of leaves, but that was it. No birds, no crickets, no wind, just silence. That first night, I slept lightly. Every small noise outside seemed louder in the quiet. A branch snapped somewhere in the woods, and I sat up, heart pounding, staring into the darkness. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer moving through the trees. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke early, made coffee on the old propane stove, and took a walk down to the creek. The water was clear, running fast over the rocks. I knelt to fill my bottle, watching the way the current twisted around my hand. That's when I noticed it. A set of footprints in the damp soil. Not mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to the edge of the water, then disappearing back into the woods. I stood up slowly, scanning the treeline. Nothing moved. The forest was still. I told myself it was probably a hunter passing through. The woods weren't private land, and it wasn't unusual for people to hike out this far, even if I hadn't seen anyone yet. Still, something about the tracks bothered me. The way they came straight to the water and left without wandering, like someone had been watching. I walked back to the cabin, my senses sharp. The whole time, I felt like I wasn't alone, like the trees were holding something just out of sight. The day passed uneventfully. I stayed close to the cabin, chopping wood, reading, trying to ignore the feeling that kept creeping over me. I almost convinced myself it was just nerves, just the isolation getting to me. But then, as the sun dipped low and I was bringing in firewood, I saw something, a figure deep in the trees, just standing there, too far to make out details, but close enough that I knew it wasn't my imagination. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A hunter? A hiker? But they weren't moving, weren't calling out, just standing, half hidden in the shadows. I turned and went inside, locking the door behind me. I grabbed my knife from my pack, set it on the table within reach. I didn't have a gun. I hadn't thought I'd need one. Night fell. The fire crackled in the stove, but the warmth didn't reach my bones. I kept checking the window, peering out into the darkness. I didn't see anything, but I knew they were still there. Around midnight, I heard something, a soft scrape against the wall of the cabin. My breath caught in my throat. I sat up in bed, knife in hand, listening. Another scrape, this time near the window. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. Nothing. I didn't sleep. By morning, there were more tracks outside. Close to the cabin this time. Deep, deliberate footprints in the dirt, circling the building. I packed my things. Fast. I should have left the night before, but I'd convinced myself it was nothing. I wasn't making that mistake again. I shoved my gear into my bag, doused the fire, and stepped onto the porch. The woods were silent. Too silent. I started walking. Fast, but not running. Running would make me look like prey. Halfway to my truck, I heard it. Footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. I moved faster, heart pounding, gripping the straps of my pack so tight my hands ached. The truck was just ahead, parked in the dirt clearing at the end of the trail. The footsteps got closer. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, threw myself inside, locked the doors. I looked up. Through the trees, a figure stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. I started the engine and tore out of there, gravel spraying under my tires. I didn't stop until I hit the main road. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle asked why, and I just said I didn't like being alone out there. But I wasn't alone. I never was. I bought the cabin 2 years ago. It was a simple place, deep in the woods, far from any town. Just a small structure, made of old pine logs, with a wood stove in the corner and a single bedroom in the back. It was quiet there, the kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat. I liked that about it. It was mine and mine alone. No traffic, no people, just trees, the wind, and the occasional sound of an animal moving through the brush. The first winter I spent there was uneventful. Snow piled high, sometimes up to my waist, but the cabin stayed warm. I kept the fire going, chopped wood every morning, hunted small game when I could. I felt at home. I wasn't scared of the wilderness, even when I heard coyotes howling at night. I had a rifle and I knew how to use it. Nothing out there could hurt me if I was careful. But then, as the second winter set in, something changed. It started with the silence. The usual sounds of the forest, birds, rustling branches, distant animal calls, all stopped. One evening, as I sat on my porch smoking, I realized I hadn't heard a single bird all day. No squirrels, no deer moving through the trees. Just a dead, heavy quiet. It made my skin crawl. I told myself it was just the season. Animals move deeper into the forest when the snow comes. That was normal. But then at night I started hearing it. At first, it was just a noise, way off in the distance. A screech, maybe an animal in pain. But it didn't sound right. It was too long, too drawn out. Like something was mimicking a scream but didn't quite know how. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Then it got closer. One night, just past midnight, I was woken up by the sound of something moving outside. Slow, deliberate steps in the snow, circling the cabin. I lay there, listening, barely breathing. My rifle was beside me, but I didn't move. The steps stopped right outside the bedroom wall. I could hear breathing. Not heavy, not human. A slow, deep inhale, then an even slower exhale. Like something was trying to smell me through the wall. I stayed like that until the sun came up. The breathing eventually stopped. The footsteps faded away. But I didn't sleep again that night. When I finally stepped outside in the morning, I saw the tracks. Huge, deep impressions in the snow, circling the cabin. They weren't bear tracks. Too long, too thin. They almost looked human, but something about them was wrong. The stride was too long, the shape slightly distorted. I followed them for a while, but they led into the thickest part of the woods. where the trees were too dense to see far. I turned back. For the next few nights, it kept coming back. Sometimes I would hear it scratching at the walls, other times just breathing. I stopped going outside at night. I kept the fire burning, rifle always in reach. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, something I hadn't seen before, but I knew that wasn't true. One night, during a snowstorm, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps, but this time, they didn't stop outside the cabin. They went up the porch steps. I held my breath as I heard the wood creak under its weight. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. A knock. 3 slow knocks on the cabin door. Not random, not the wind. Deliberate, like it was waiting for me to open up. I didn't move. The knocking came again. 3 slow, steady knocks. Then silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my heart pounding. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, the sun was coming through the window. The storm had stopped, but something was wrong. The door was open, just slightly but open. Snow had blown in, covering the floor. My rifle was still in my hands, my body stiff from staying in the same position all night. I checked the tracks outside. They were there, leading away from the porch back into the woods. But something else caught my eye. The footprints weren't just leading away, they were coming from the tree line, but not in a straight line. They were weaving like whatever had made them was stumbling or crawling. That day, I made a decision. I packed my things, took what I could fit in my truck, and left the rest. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. I didn't tell anyone what happened. What could I say? That something knocked on my door in the middle of a snowstorm and left tracks that shouldn't exist? No one would believe me. I never went back. I never checked to see if anyone else had moved in, if the place was still standing. I didn't want to know. I still dream about it sometimes. The breathing, the knocking, and sometimes, in the dead of night, I wake up thinking I hear it again, right outside my window, waiting. I got the cabin cheap. Too cheap. I knew it the second I saw the listing. A remote place, deep in the woods, only accessible by an old logging road. The ad made it sound like a dream. Secluded, peaceful, perfect for a break from the city. But the price didn't match. A place like that, even run down, should have gone for way more. Still, I bought it. I told myself there had to be a catch, bad insulation, maybe some structural damage, but I didn't care. I needed a break. The city was grinding me down, and I figured a couple of months alone in the woods would fix something in me. The drive out was rough. The road wasn't maintained, just a mess of dirt and rocks with deep ruts where heavy trucks must have passed years ago. My truck barely made it, tires skidding in the mud where the spring melt had softened the ground. Trees pressed close on both sides, branches clawing at the windows. I kept the radio off. The farther I got, the heavier the silence became. The cabin was smaller than I expected. 1 floor, just a big open space with a small kitchen against one wall and a wood stove near the center. The walls were bare, rough wood darkened with age. There was 1 bedroom, a tiny bathroom, and a porch out front. No electricity, no plumbing except for a rusted-out pump that wheezed when I tested it. I'd have to rely on the well outside and the wood stove for heat. It smelled old inside. Not bad, just stale, like no one had lived there in years. Dust coated the windowsills, and the floor creaked under my boots. The first couple of days were fine. I kept busy clearing brush, chopping wood, checking over the cabin for leaks or damage. It felt good to work with my hands, to get tired in a way that had nothing to do with stress or deadlines. At night, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind in the trees, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals moving through the undergrowth. Then, on the 3rd night, I woke up to a sound. It was quiet, subtle. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I lay there, barely breathing, I realized it was something else. A creaking sound, slow and rhythmic, like weight shifting on wood, like footsteps. I sat up, heart pounding. The cabin had no neighbors, no hikers, no reason for anyone to be out there. I listened, straining to hear past the blood rushing in my ears. Nothing, just silence. I told myself it was the cabin settling, the old wood shifting with the temperature drop. I forced myself to lie back down, but sleep didn't come easy. The next day, I checked around the cabin. The ground was soft from the melt, but I didn't see any tracks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I locked the door. It was a flimsy thing, just a simple latch, but it made me feel better. I kept my hatchet close. The sound came again. This time it was louder. A definite creak, then another. Slow, deliberate, like someone was trying to move without being heard. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then the worst sound yet. The soft, unmistakable scratch of something dragging along the outside wall. I sat up so fast the mattress creaked under me. My heart slammed in my chest. I gripped the hatchet so hard my knuckles ached. The sound stopped. Silence. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every muscle in my body locked up. Eventually, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep. Morning felt unreal, like the night before had been some half-dream thing. But I checked the walls. The wood was old, rough, but on the side facing the trees, I found marks. Faint, almost too light to notice. Long, uneven scratches running low near the foundation. Not claw marks, not from an animal. Too deliberate. I thought about leaving, packing up, driving back to town, selling the place and never looking back. But something about that felt wrong. I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. That night I stayed up. I kept the lantern low, axe across my lap, every muscle tight. Hours passed. Nothing. Just the usual sounds of the forest, the distant cry of a coyote. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it all. Then, around 3 in the morning, the sound came back. Not footsteps, not scratching, breathing. Low, slow, just outside the window. I didn't move. I barely blinked. I stayed there for minutes, just breathing. Deep, steady inhales like it was testing the air. Then, a shuffle. The faintest creak of wood. I gripped the axe and finally forced myself to move. Just a little. Just enough to shift my weight. The bed frame let out a soft groan. The breathing stopped. Silence. Then, footsteps. Fast this time, retreating into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. Morning light felt unreal. I went outside, boots crunching in the frost. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, my breath clouding in the cold air. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not boots. Not shoes. Bare feet. Too big to be a child's, too narrow for a man's. The toes dug deep, gripping the mud. They led from the trees to my window, then back. I stood there a long time, staring. My mind felt slow, refusing to make sense of what I was seeing. I packed up. I didn't even bother locking the cabin behind me. I threw everything in the truck and tore down that old logging road so fast I nearly put myself in a ditch. I sold the cabin a month later. Didn't go back, didn't explain. Took a loss on the sale and didn't care. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I remembered. The road was nothing but a narrow stretch of gravel, winding through thick trees that pressed in from both sides. It felt like I had been driving forever, even though I knew it had only been a couple of hours since I left the last real town. The sun was low in the sky, filtering through the trees in long golden streaks. I should have left earlier. I hadn't been to the cabin in years. It belonged to my uncle, though he rarely used it anymore. He had given me the keys a long time ago, said I could take it over if I wanted, but I never got around to it. Life got in the way. Work, relationships, excuses. But I needed this weekend. No distractions, no noise, no people. Just me and the silence. By the time I pulled up, the sun had dipped below the treetops. The cabin stood just where I remembered, a squat wooden structure with a slanted roof, set back from the edge of a small, still lake. The windows were dark. It looked abandoned. I stepped out of the truck, stretching my legs. The air was cool, the kind of sharp chill that comes when the seasons start to shift. I grabbed my bag and the small cooler from the back, then made my way to the front door. The key stuck a little, but after a few jiggles, the lock turned. Inside, The air was stale. The place smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly damp. I flicked the light switch. Nothing. I sighed. I had forgotten that the power came from a generator, which I'd have to start myself. I set my bag down and went back outside, making my way around the cabin to the small shed where the generator was stored. It was an old thing, but after a couple of hard pulls, it sputtered to life. The lights inside flickered on. Back inside, I took a quick look around. Everything was the way I remembered. A small kitchen with outdated appliances, a couch pushed against one wall, a heavy wooden table near the window. The bedroom was just a narrow space with a twin bed and a dresser. There was a bathroom, but no running water, just a pump out back near the treeline. Simple, but enough. I lit the wood stove in the corner, the dry logs catching easily. The warmth spread through the cabin, fighting off the chill. I ate a quick meal from the cooler, then sat on the couch, staring at the fire. The quiet was deeper than I had expected. No cars, no voices, just the crackling wood and the faint sound of the wind moving through the trees. After a while, I heard something else, a soft rustling outside. Probably just the wind, or maybe an animal. This was the woods, after all, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't just the sound itself, but the way it stopped suddenly, as if whatever was making it had frozen in place. Listening, I stood up and walked to the window. The trees swayed gently in the breeze. Nothing moved. I told myself I was being stupid, that it was just a raccoon or a deer, and forced myself to relax. I turned away from the window, but just as I did, I heard it again. Closer. I grabbed the flashlight from the counter and stepped onto the porch. The beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees. My truck was parked where I had left it. The path leading down to the lake was empty. I shined the light toward the shed. Nothing. I listened. The wind had died down. The woods were still. Too still. I stayed there for a while, scanning the tree line, then shook my head and went back inside, locking the door behind me. It was probably just my nerves. I wasn't used to this kind of quiet anymore. I forced myself to sleep, but it was uneasy. I woke up at some point in the night, heart pounding for no reason I could name. The cabin was dark, the fire reduced to glowing embers. The silence pressed in, thick and heavy. I stayed like that for a long time, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I drifted off again. The next morning, I stepped outside to get water from the pump. The air was cold, the ground damp from a light mist. I walked toward the pump, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, then stopped. There were footprints in the dirt, not mine. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They led from the treeline, stopping just a few feet from the cabin, right near the window where I had stood the night before. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The prints were fresh, the edges still sharp. Someone had been out here while I was sleeping. I forced myself to move, following the tracks with my eyes. They didn't lead to the door. They didn't even go to the shed. They came from the woods, stopped near the window, then turned back the way they came. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe a hiker someone lost. But deep down, I knew that wasn't right. This cabin was too far from any trail. And why would someone come this close, then leave without knocking? I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. The day passed slowly. I spent most of it inside, forcing myself to read, to eat, to pretend I wasn't constantly listening for sounds outside. The woods felt different now, not peaceful but watchful. I didn't go back outside until the sun started to set. When I did, I found more tracks. They were closer this time, right up to the porch. I stood there, staring at them, my mind racing. The prints weren't deep, but they were clear. Someone had been standing just outside the cabin while I was inside, listening, watching. I went back in, bolting the door. My hands were shaking. I grabbed the old rifle my uncle kept above the fireplace, checking that it was loaded. I didn't know if I could actually use it, but it made me feel better having it in my hands. That night, I sat by the fire waiting. The cabin felt smaller, the walls pressing in. Hours passed. Then, Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A slow, deliberate creak from the porch. I held my breath. Another creak. Closer. Then nothing. The silence stretched on. My heart pounded so loud I thought whoever was out there could hear it. Then the doorknob rattled. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door even though I could barely see. My mouth was dry. I wanted to shout, to make some noise, but I couldn't. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, the gun shaking in my hands. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the windows. I waited until the sun was fully up before opening the door. The footprints were there, right outside, leading back into the woods. I didn't stay to see where they went. I packed my things, threw them into the truck, and drove away without looking back. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. The cabin was old. I could smell it the second I stepped inside. The scent of damp wood, mildew, and something stale, like dust left too long in the corners of a closed room. The door creaked when I pushed it open, the sound sharp against the heavy silence of the forest behind me. The air inside was cool, but not fresh. Felt like no one had been here in a long time. I dropped my bag near the door and took a slow look around. The walls were lined with rough-hewn logs, the gaps between them filled with dried mud or some kind of old insulation. A stone fireplace took up most of the far wall, its chimney blackened from years of use. The furniture was sparse. A wooden table with 2 chairs, a sagging couch with faded fabric, and a narrow bed against the wall, covered in a scratchy-looking wool blanket. There was a single window above the bed, but the glass was thick with dust, letting in only a weak, gray light from the overcast sky outside. I had rented this place for the weekend, thinking a few days alone in the woods would clear my head. Too much noise back home. Work, traffic, people. I needed the quiet. No phone calls, no emails, no obligations. Just me and the trees, maybe a few hikes, some reading, some sleep. The idea had sounded perfect when I booked it. Now, standing in the dim, stale-smelling cabin, I felt something I hadn't expected, unease. I shook it off and got to work. First, I lit the lantern on the table. The glow flickered against the walls, casting long, shifting shadows. Then, I unrolled my sleeping bag on the bed, feeling the stiff, uneven mattress beneath it. I unpacked the food I'd brought, cans of soup, granola bars, a few bottles of water, and set them on the table. There was an old cast-iron stove near the fireplace, but I wasn't sure if it still worked. Probably not. I had my camping stove anyway. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I walked around outside for a bit, checking out the surroundings. The trees were thick, tall pines and oaks, their branches bare from the season. The sky was a dull gray, promising rain. I didn't stray too far from the cabin, just enough to stretch my legs and get a feel for the place. No other cabins nearby, no signs of people. Just the wind through the branches and the distant call of a crow somewhere in the trees. When I got back, I started a fire in the fireplace. The woodpile outside was damp, but I found some dry pieces underneath. The flames caught slowly, crackling as they ate through the bark. The heat was comforting, pushing back the cabin's deep chill. I sat on the couch, eating a granola bar, watching the flames flicker. It was quiet, too quiet. I kept waiting for the usual sounds of the woods, the rustle of leaves, the chirp of crickets, the hoot of an owl. But there was nothing, just the occasional gust of wind against the trees. As the hours dragged on, I tried to push the feeling away, but it clung to me, an odd, nagging sense that something wasn't right. I wasn't scared, not yet, just on edge. I told myself I was being ridiculous. The isolation was getting to me, that was all. I had spent too much time in the city, too used to the constant hum of cars, voices, electricity. My brain was struggling to adjust to the lack of noise. That had to be it. Night came fast. The fire was burning low, and the cabin was cold again. I added more wood, then climbed into my sleeping bag. The mattress underneath was as uncomfortable as I'd expected, but I was tired. My body ached from the long drive, the unpacking, the cold air pressing in from outside. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to a dull glow, barely enough light to see by. The air was thick, heavy. I shifted, listening. Then I heard it. A sound outside. Not the wind. Not an animal rustling in the underbrush. Something else. Slow, deliberate footsteps. My breath caught. I lay still, barely daring to move. The sound came again, closer this time. A soft crunch of dead leaves. The scrape of something against the wooden porch outside the door. I didn't have a weapon. Just a small pocket knife in my bag, useless against anything bigger than a rabbit. I reached for it anyway, gripping the cool metal handle in my fist. Silence. Then, a creak. The porch. Something shifting its weight. Standing right outside. I forced myself to breathe slowly, quietly. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure it would give me away. Another creak. A pause. Then the doorknob rattled. I didn't move. Didn't even blink. The knob turned, slow and careful, testing the lock. It held. Silence again. I stared at the door, waiting. I could feel the blood pounding in my temples. My hands slick with sweat despite the cold. Then footsteps again. Moving away this time. Slow, steady. Fading into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Morning came, gray and cold. I didn't move from the bed until the light filled the cabin. Even then, I waited, listening, making sure I was truly alone. When I finally got up, I checked the door. Still locked. My backpack was still near the table, my food untouched. Nothing looked different. But when I stepped outside, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the trees to the porch, stopping just outside the door. Whoever had been there last night had stood there for a long time. Listening. Watching. I packed my things in minutes. I didn't care about the rental agreement, about the money I'd spent. I didn't care about anything except getting out. The drive back to town was a blur. My hands were tight on the wheel, my eyes darting to the treeline, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was hours away, back in the noise of the city, where the silence couldn't follow me. I never went back to that cabin. I never even looked up its listing again, and I never stopped wondering who had been outside my door that night, or why they had come. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to sink behind the dense treeline. The drive had been long, winding through back roads and gravel paths, the kind of route that made you feel truly alone. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, that was the whole point of this trip, to get away from everything for a while, to breathe in the fresh air, to exist in a place where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the crackle of a fire. The cabin itself was old but sturdy, a single-story structure made of thick logs with a tin roof that rattled whenever the wind picked up. It sat about 50 feet from the edge of a wide, slow-moving river, the kind that looked perfect for fishing. There was no electricity, no running water, just a wood stove for heat and a small outhouse about 20 yards behind the cabin. I parked the truck and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the occasional rustle of something unseen moving through the undergrowth. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cold, clean air, and then got to work unloading my supplies. I carried everything inside, coolers filled with food, a few jugs of water, a rifle in case I ran into trouble, and a lantern for light once the sun went down. The cabin was simple inside. A single room with a cot pushed against one wall, a table and 2 chairs in the center, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. There were shelves lined with old canned goods, most of which were probably long expired. The windows were small, just enough to let in some light but not much else. By the time I had everything set up, the sun had almost disappeared, leaving behind streaks of deep orange and pink across the sky. I decided to gather some firewood before it got too dark. The forest around the cabin was thick with trees, mostly pine and birch, and the ground was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves. I walked a little ways in, picking up fallen branches and breaking them over my knee when they were too long. That's when I noticed it. A tree, its bark stripped away in long, deep claw marks. The gashes were fresh, the exposed wood still pale and raw. I froze, staring at the marks, my mind racing. There was only one animal that could have made them, a bear. I turned, scanning the trees, listening for anything out of place. The forest had gone quiet, the way it does when something big is near. My heart was pounding now, but I didn't see anything. I told myself it was probably old, from days ago, maybe even longer. Still, I kept my rifle close as I hurried back to the cabin, dragging the firewood behind me. Inside, I locked the door and started a fire in the stove, the small space warming quickly. I ate dinner in silence, listening to the sounds outside, but there was nothing unusual. Just the wind, the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. I told myself there was nothing to worry about. Bears were common in these woods, but they usually avoided people. That night, I lay in the cot, staring up at the wooden ceiling, listening. The fire had died down to embers, the room cast in a dull orange glow. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside had me on edge. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the natural sounds of the woods. Then I heard it, a low, heavy breathing, slow, measured, just outside the wall near my head. My entire body tensed. I held my breath, listening. It was close, so close that I could hear the faint rumble of each exhale, the soft huff of air being pushed through a massive body. I reached for the rifle, gripping it tight, my hands slick with sweat. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity, deep and steady. Then, a long, dragging sound, like something heavy brushing against the logs of the cabin. A pause, a sniff, another long breath, and then silence. I lay there, frozen, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst from my chest. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I didn't move, barely even breathed. Eventually, exhaustion won. My body gave in, and at some point I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the area around the cabin. The dirt was disturbed, deep indentations in the earth where something large had stood. I followed the tracks around the side of the cabin and felt my stomach drop. Claw marks, fresh ones, deep, jagged gouges along the logs, just beneath the window where my head had been the night before. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading back to town, but something in me resisted. I'd come out here to get away, to clear my head. A bear passing through wasn't enough to chase me off. So I told myself I'd be more careful. I'd keep my rifle close, store my food properly, make sure I didn't leave anything out that might attract it. That day passed without incident. I fished in the river, kept the fire going, made sure the doors and windows were secure before nightfall. I told myself it was fine, that I was fine. Then night came. It started with the sound of branches snapping in the distance. First, I ignored it. Animals moved through the forest all the time. But then it got closer, heavier, deliberate. I sat in the dark, rifle across my lap, barely breathing. Then something massive hit the side of the cabin. The entire structure shook, dust raining down from the rafters. Another hit, harder this time, the sound of claws scraping against wood. I stood, backing away from the door, my mind racing. I thought about firing a warning shot, but I didn't want to anger it. Instead, I grabbed the lantern, held it up to the window, and then I saw it, a massive shadow just beyond the glass, a head bigger than any I had ever seen, dark eyes reflecting the flickering light. Its breath fogged up the glass, nostrils flaring as it sniffed. Then, it let out a low, guttural growl, so deep I felt it in my chest. I fired, not at it, but into the air, the gunshot deafening in the enclosed space. The bear recoiled, letting out a startled roar before crashing through the undergrowth, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the door, rifle in hand, waiting, listening. By morning, it was gone. I found deep gouges in the wood, massive prints in the dirt, but no sign of the bear itself. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things, loaded the truck, and left that place behind. The cabin is still there, I'm sure. The scars on the wood still marking the place where something ancient and wild reminded me just how small I was. But I'll never go back. Some places, no matter how beautiful, don't belong to us. And I'd learned, in the most terrifying way possible, that the wilderness doesn't care why you're there. It only cares that you are. I didn't want to go to the cabin alone. It wasn't fear, not really, just that being out in the middle of nowhere by myself made me uneasy. But it wasn't like I had a choice. My brother, Dan, had bought the place for cheap. A rundown cabin deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town. He had this dream of fixing it up and turning it into a hunting retreat. A couple of our friends had helped him get started, but work and life got in the way, and the place sat unfinished. Then he broke his leg, slipped on some ice, snapped his tibia clean. He called me up, asked me to check on the cabin, make sure no animals had gotten inside, see if the roof was still holding up under all the snow. Just a quick trip, he said. I took my truck. The drive was long. The last stretch just a narrow road cutting through thick forest. It was late February, snow still clinging to the ground, the trees bare and skeletal. I kept my music low, eyes flicking between the road and the trees. Felt too quiet out there, too still. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of my tires on the frozen dirt. The cabin sat at the end of the road, half buried in snow. A small, single-story place with a steep roof and a wraparound porch. The front door was still locked, no signs of forced entry. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. The air was stale. The furniture was basic, a couch, a table, a couple of chairs, the bed in the back room. A wood stove in the corner, firewood stacked neatly beside it. Everything was just as Dan had left it. I checked the windows, ran water from the well pump just to see if it still worked. Everything seemed fine. I considered heading back right then, but the sun was already low, and I wasn't thrilled about navigating those roads in the dark. I built a fire in the wood stove, warmed up a can of soup, and sat at the table, listening to the fire crackle. I kept telling myself I'd be fine, that I was being paranoid, but something felt off. Not wrong, just off, like the cabin wasn't really empty. I tried to sleep but couldn't. Every sound outside had me staring at the ceiling, straining to hear. I told myself it was just the forest settling. But around midnight, I heard something that wasn't the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching through the snow outside the cabin. I held my breath. The fire had burned low, the room dark except for the faint glow of embers. The footsteps stopped near the porch. My gun was in my truck. Not helpful. I grabbed the hatchet from beside the woodpile and eased out of bed, moving as quietly as I could. I kept to the shadows, heart hammering, waiting for a knock. But there was no knock, no sound at all now, just silence. I stood there for what felt like hours before I finally forced myself to check the window. Nothing, just trees and darkness. My breath fogged up the glass. I pressed my ear against the wood of the door, listening, but all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Eventually, I crawled back into bed, clutching the hatchet. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer, a raccoon, something small, harmless. I barely slept. Morning came, dull and gray. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the snow. My stomach knotted. There were footprints, deep human footprints leading from the tree line to the porch, but no tracks leading away. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, my boots crunching in the snow. Nothing, just those prints leading up to the porch, stopping dead. It didn't make sense. I needed to leave. Now, I grabbed my bag, stuffed it with the essentials, and made for the truck. I threw open the door, tossed my things inside. That's when I noticed something on the windshield. A single handprint, smudged, like someone had pressed their palm against the glass and dragged it downward. I didn't look around. I didn't hesitate. I started the truck, peeled out of there so fast I fishtailed on the ice. My heart pounded all the way down that road. I told myself it was some local messing with me, some hunter playing a joke. But I never went back. Dan sold the cabin that summer. I didn't ask who bought it. I didn't care. I just knew I wasn't stepping foot there again. I never liked the idea of being alone in the woods, the silence of it, the way the trees swallowed sound. But when my cousin Jason offered me his cabin for a week, I took it. He said it would be good for me, get away from the city, clear my head. I didn't argue. I needed the break. The cabin was about 4 hours north of the city, buried in the woods off an unmarked road. I followed the directions Jason gave me, turning off the main highway onto a dirt path that looked like it hadn't been used in months. The farther I drove, the more I regretted saying yes. My tires kicked up loose rocks, the trees pressed in on both sides, and by the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I felt like I'd driven into another world. It was a simple place. One story, dark wood, a tin roof. Jason told me there was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just a radio for emergencies. That was fine. I wanted the isolation. At least that's what I told myself. I parked, grabbed my bag, and stepped onto the porch. The door was unlocked, just like Jason said it would be. Inside, it smelled like dust and pine. There was a small kitchen, a couch, a wood stove. The bedroom was barely big enough for the bed. It was quiet, too quiet. I spent the first night reading by the lantern light, listening to the wind rattle the trees. It wasn't bad, almost peaceful, but something about the darkness outside the windows unsettled me. I kept looking up, half expecting to see movement. Nothing, just my own paranoia. The second day I took a walk. There was a small lake about a mile from the cabin, Jason had said. I found it easily enough, the water still reflecting the sky. I sat on a rock by the shore, let the sun warm my face. It was nice, calming. But then, as I turned to head back, I noticed something strange. Boot prints in the mud. I wasn't sure why it bothered me at first. Maybe Jason had been up here recently. Maybe another hiker. But the more I looked, the more I realized something was off. The prints were fresh, deep, leading toward the cabin. I followed them back, my pulse in my throat. The closer I got, the worse it felt. The prints didn't turn off, didn't lead anywhere else. They went straight to the cabin's front door. And then they stopped. I stood there, staring, my breath shallow. The door was closed, same as I'd left it. No signs of a break-in, no sign of anything. But those prints hadn't been there when I arrived. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them before. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every sound outside made me flinch. The creak of the trees, the rustle of leaves, and then something else, something closer. Footsteps. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, coming from the porch. I sat up, my heart hammering. The floorboards groaned under a shifting weight. I reached for the lantern, turned the knob. Light filled the room. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours. Finally, I got up, creeping toward the window. I pulled the curtain back just an inch, just enough to see. Nothing. The porch was empty. The clearing beyond it, empty. But I knew I'd heard it. I knew someone had been there. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something moving outside. I wanted to believe it was just an animal. A raccoon, maybe, a deer. But I didn't believe it. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were more prints, fresh ones. They circled the cabin, leading to the back door, stopping there. My stomach dropped. Someone had stood there, watching, listening. I packed my bag, ready to leave. But as I reached for my keys, I hesitated. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just some lost hunter passing through. If I left now, I'd feel like an idiot. I decided to stay, just one more night. I kept my axe by the bed, locked the doors. I wouldn't let fear drive me out. Night fell. The woods turned black. I sat by the window staring out, waiting. For what? I didn't know. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. A footstep, then another. I gripped the axe, my knuckles white. The footsteps circled the cabin, slow, measured. They stopped just outside my window. I held my breath. I didn't move. Something pressed against the glass. A hand, fingers spread wide, palm flat. I lunged for the lantern, twisted the knob. Light flooded the room. The hand disappeared. The footsteps retreated, fast this time, disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat there, axe in hand, waiting for dawn. As soon as the sun rose, I was out the door. I didn't look back. I didn't check for more prints. I just drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. When I finally reached cell service, I called Jason, told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that made my skin crawl. No one's supposed to be up there. I haven't been back since, and I never will. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind pushing against the trees, maybe the branches rubbing together. But then I heard it again. Slow, deliberate steps, the crunch of gravel, the soft snap of twigs breaking underfoot. I lay still in my sleeping bag, my breath held, listening. It was past midnight, and I was alone in the cabin. The old place belonged to my uncle, who had built it years ago as a hunting retreat. He hardly used it anymore, but he let me borrow it for a weekend. I had wanted the solitude, the quiet. No service, no people, just me and the deep woods. Now, lying there in the dark, I regretted it. The sound moved around the cabin, slow and unhurried, as if whoever or whatever. It had all the time in the world. I reached for my phone out of instinct, even though I already knew it was useless out here. No signal, no way to call for help. The footsteps stopped near the front door. My uncle had warned me about black bears in the area, said they sometimes got curious, but this didn't feel like a bear. Felt like something else. I didn't hear the snuffling sounds a bear would make. No heavy breathing, just those slow, steady footsteps. I eased out of my sleeping bag, careful not to make a sound. The cabin was small, just one room with a cot, a wood stove, and a kitchenette. The front door was locked, but the windows weren't exactly secure. I wished I had brought a gun. All I had was a hunting knife and a hatchet. A soft scrape against the doorframe made my skin crawl. I held my breath, waiting, then silence. No footsteps, no sound at all. I strained my ears, trying to hear past the loud thudding of my own heartbeat. Minutes passed, maybe more than minutes, I had no way to tell. The silence stretched, pressing down on me, making the air feel thick. And then, finally, I heard it again, but further away now, moving off into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up in the cot, knife in hand, and waited for the sky to lighten. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside. There were tracks in the dirt, circling the cabin. Human tracks. No shoes, just bare feet pressed into the damp earth. I should have left right then. I should have packed up and hiked back to my truck. But I didn't. I told myself it was probably just some drunk hiker or some weird backwoods guy messing around. Stupid, but not dangerous. I had food, water, and a whole weekend ahead of me. I wasn't about to let some weirdo ruin my trip. The day passed without anything unusual. I went fishing at the lake a few miles out, came back, made dinner. By the time the sun set, I had convinced myself that it had been nothing, just my imagination making too much out of some sounds in the night. Then, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something. My backpack, which I had left zipped up on the table, was open. I knew for a fact I hadn't left it like that. I checked inside. My extra flashlight was missing. A deep, sinking feeling settled in my stomach. I checked the door and windows, still locked, but someone had been inside. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in the cot, knife in hand, listening. The night outside was silent, too silent. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Then, just past midnight, the footsteps came back. Slow, closer. A deliberate sound, like someone walking just on the edge of the clearing, waiting, listening. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The footsteps stopped just outside the window. I could feel the presence there, just on the other side of the thin wooden walls. And then, a sound that made my stomach drop. Breathing. Slow, deep breaths, right against the window. I clenched my knife so hard my hand ached. My pulse pounded in my ears. I stared at the window, expecting to see a shadow, a face, something. But I saw nothing. The breathing continued for what felt like forever. Then slowly it faded. The footsteps moved away, back into the trees. I didn't sleep. I waited for dawn, every muscle in my body tight. As soon as the sky turned gray, I threw everything into my pack and left. I didn't even bother eating. I just grabbed my gear and walked as fast as I could down the trail. When I got back to my truck, there was a fresh set of bare footprints in the dirt. They led right up to the driver's side door. I got in, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. I told my uncle about it later. He got quiet, then said I wasn't the first. Other people who had stayed there had seen the tracks, heard the footsteps. One guy had even seen someone standing in the tree line watching. My uncle doesn't go to the cabin anymore. Neither do I. Whoever or whatever is out there, they can have it. I booked the cabin because I wanted quiet. I wanted to be away from everything. The constant noise of the city, the endless messages on my phone, the pressure of work. It was deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town, isolated in the way I needed. No service, no internet. Just trees, a lake, and an old wooden cabin with a fireplace. I had stocked up on supplies. Enough food for a week, extra batteries, a good knife, and a hunting rifle I barely knew how to use but brought anyway, just in case. The first night was peaceful. I sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees, watching the sky darken. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I slept deeply, wrapped in thick blankets, the sound of crickets and distant owls lulling me into unconsciousness. The second night, I noticed something was off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a vague unease. The trees felt too still, the air too silent. I told myself it was my imagination, that my city brain wasn't used to this level of quiet. But then I heard something, a rustling in the brush, heavy and deliberate. Not the wind, not a small animal, something bigger. I grabbed the rifle from beside my bed, but when I shined my flashlight out the window, I saw nothing. The third night, I found the footprints. They were around the cabin, deep impressions in the soft earth, larger than my own. Bare feet, human. They circled the structure, stopping just beneath the windows, then leading back into the woods. My stomach clenched. I hadn't seen another person since I got here. Who the hell would be walking around barefoot in the middle of nowhere? I stayed inside that night, locking the doors, keeping the rifle close. Every noise made my skin crawl. The creak of the old wood, the occasional snap of a branch outside. I barely slept. On the fourth day, I found more signs. The food storage outside had been opened, but nothing was taken, just left open. A pile of sticks appeared near the cabin, stacked neatly, purposefully, like a message. I started to feel watched. My own paranoia, maybe, but I couldn't shake it. I checked my supplies, making sure everything was where I left it. That almost made it worse. If someone wanted to steal, they would have taken something. But they hadn't. They were just there. That night, I heard breathing. Just outside the window, slow and heavy. I stayed frozen in my bed, every muscle tensed, waiting. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The sound lingered for what felt like forever before finally retreating back into the woods. I lay awake until the first light crept through the trees. By the fifth day, I was done. I packed everything I could fit in my bag and decided to leave early. I didn't care about the reservation. I didn't care about the money I spent. Something was out there, and I didn't want to find out what it was. I walked fast, rifle slung over my shoulder, constantly checking behind me. The trail felt longer than I remembered. The trees pressed in on me. Every sound made me jump. Then I saw it. Person. Standing just off the path, half hidden behind a tree. Barefoot, clothes torn, skin dark with dirt. Their face was obscured by matted hair. They didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me. My pulse hammered in my ears. I gripped the rifle tighter and forced myself to keep walking, not looking away, not turning my back. They didn't follow, not at first, but as I moved further down the trail, I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate. I didn't stop. I didn't run. I just kept moving, heart pounding, hands sweating against the wood of the rifle. The footsteps stayed with me, always just behind, just out of sight. When I finally reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, throwing my bag into the passenger seat. I looked back one last time. The trail was empty. The trees stood still. No sign of the figure. I locked the doors and drove without stopping, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. I didn't look back again. I didn't check the rearview mirror. I just drove until I was far away from that place, from whatever had been watching me, from whatever had been waiting outside my window at night. I don't know who they were. I don't want to know. I just know I'll never go back. I got the cabin cheap because the last owner disappeared. Not just disappeared like he ran off or something. I mean, gone without a trace, truck still parked outside, all his things inside, fridge still full. That kind of gone. It had been months, and no one had found anything. Small-town cops shrugged it off as some personal problem, like he wanted to start fresh somewhere else. But everyone in town knew that didn't make sense. The guy had lived here his whole life. He wasn't about to leave his dog behind, either. But they found her dead on the porch, throat torn out like something had gone at her. I should have listened to that feeling in my gut that told me to leave it alone. But it was cheap and I wanted space. I wanted to be away from people, deep in the woods where no one would bother me. I thought it was perfect. Took me a full day to move in. The place was dusty but solid, tucked back in the trees, miles away from the next nearest house. The property stretched for acres, all dense woods, thick with old-growth trees. No neighbors, no traffic. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of some small animal in the underbrush. The first few nights were normal. It was quiet, aside from the usual forest sounds. Owls hooting, coyotes yipping in the distance, branches creaking in the wind. It was peaceful. I'd sit on the porch at night with a beer, listening to the woods and enjoying the solitude. Then I started noticing things. First, the woods felt different. It's hard to explain, but if you've ever been deep enough into the wilderness, you know what I mean. There's a way the forest feels at night, a kind of hum, a constant movement of life. Changed. The sounds stopped. No birds, no insects, no distant howls. Just silence. That deep, unnatural silence that makes your skin crawl. One night, I woke up around 2 in the morning, heart pounding, ears straining. I didn't know what had woken me at first. Then I heard it. Slow, heavy footsteps outside the cabin. It wasn't a bear. I know what bears sound like. This was deliberate. Not the four-legged shuffle of a deer or the sharp rustling of a raccoon. These were footsteps, 2 feet moving carefully, deliberately through the dry leaves and twigs outside. I stayed completely still, barely breathing, listening. They stopped just outside the bedroom window. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, and then I heard a slow, deep inhale. Someone, or something, was sniffing at the window. I grabbed the rifle I kept by the bed and sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. The sniffing stopped. Silence stretched out again, thick and heavy. Then, just as I was starting to think I imagined it, the footsteps started up again. But this time, they moved away, disappearing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt outside my window. Bare feet, human-like but wrong. Too long, too narrow. The toes were too pointed, the arch too high. I followed them a few yards into the woods before they vanished. just stopped, like whatever made them had lifted off the ground and disappeared. I should have left right then, packed up my truck and driven the hell away. But I didn't. I told myself it was some trick of the light, some natural thing I didn't understand. I spent the day cutting wood, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled deep in my stomach. That night, it came back. I was on the porch, smoking, when I heard it again. Footsteps in the trees. Slow, careful. Watching. I turned off the porch light and gripped my rifle, staring into the darkness. The trees were thick, the moon barely cutting through, but I saw movement. A shape, just beyond the reach of the light. Tall, thin, moving on two legs. It wasn't a person. People don't move like that. I aimed the rifle, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't want to shoot. Not yet. I just wanted it to know I saw it. That I wasn't some helpless thing waiting to be hunted. The shape stopped. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel it watching me. Then it grinned. Not a normal grin. Too wide. Too many teeth. White in the darkness. And then it dropped onto all fours and ran. Not like a man, not like an animal. Something between. Too fast, too smooth. Gone into the trees before I could even think to pull the trigger. I didn't sleep that night either. The next day, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for whatever it was to get bold enough to come closer. I was leaving. I packed my things, loaded up the truck, and by the time the sun was starting to set, I was ready to go. But the truck wouldn't start. Battery was fine. Gas tank full. Nothing should have been wrong with it, but when I turned the key, it just clicked. No engine turning over, no sign of life. I tried again. Nothing. The sun was dipping below the trees. The silence was creeping in again. I grabbed my rifle and the flashlight, locking the truck and heading back inside. I wasn't going to sit in a dead truck in the middle of the woods when something was out there. The night stretched on. I sat in the dark, rifle across my lap, waiting. The footsteps came again, circling the cabin this time, slow and steady, not trying to be quiet anymore. I heard scratching at the walls, a low huffing breath against the window. It was playing with me, testing me. Then, around 3 in the morning, the doorknob rattled. I raised the rifle, aiming at the door. The rattling stopped. Silence again. A long, stretched-out moment where nothing happened. Then a soft, deliberate knock. Just 3 knocks. Slow. Mocking. I fired through the door. The gunshot echoed through the woods, ringing in my ears. I heard a low, guttural growl, deep and unnatural, followed by heavy footsteps sprinting into the trees. I didn't sleep. I sat there until dawn, heart hammering, gun ready. When the sun rose, I went outside. There was no blood, no body, just deep gouges in the wood of the door, like something with claws had dragged them down the surface. The footprints were there too, circling the cabin. My truck started on the first try. I left everything behind, didn't even go back inside, just got in and drove. I don't know what was out there. I don't want to know. I just know I'm never going back. A few months later, I checked online, curiosity getting the best of me. The cabin was listed for sale again, cheaper than before. I didn't click on it. I closed the page and turned off my computer. Some things are better left alone. I drove up the long dirt road, the truck's tires crunching over the gravel. The cabin sat alone in the thick woods, far from the highway. The nearest town was an hour away, and the closest neighbor was a hunting camp miles down another winding trail. It was exactly what I wanted. A quiet, isolated place to spend a few days, maybe a week, just unwinding. I had rented the cabin online. The listing made it seem like a simple but sturdy structure. A small bedroom, a bathroom, a kitchen with an old wood stove, and a living room with a fireplace. No Wi-Fi, no television, just a radio and a stack of old books on a shelf. Perfect. When I arrived, I took my time unpacking. The late afternoon sun was slipping behind the trees, casting long shadows through the clearing. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. I stacked my firewood near the door and brought my food inside, stuffing the fridge with enough supplies to last me a while. Then, I took a walk around the property. The trees were dense, pressing in on all sides. The trail I had driven up was the only real break in the thick woods. I wandered around the back of the cabin and found an old, rusted-out truck, half sunk into the earth, the tires deflated and rotting. A pile of firewood was stacked under a tarp nearby, though it looked like no one had used it in years. As I stood there, I had the oddest feeling, like I was being watched. It wasn't strong, just a quiet, nagging sense of something nearby. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees, but there was nothing. Just the woods, just the quiet. I shrugged it off and went back inside. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace and sat in an old armchair with a book. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the branches against the roof. It made the cabin feel even smaller, like I was wrapped in a wooden shell, surrounded by endless trees. I must have dozed off. I woke to the fire nearly burned out, glowing embers shifting in the hearth. The wind had stopped. Everything was still, too still. I sat up, listening. Then I heard it. A soft, deliberate sound outside. Something moving. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a falling branch or some animal scurrying through the underbrush. It was slow, heavy, careful. Footsteps. I held my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped. Silence stretched so long that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. But then, just as I was about to let out a breath, something scraped against the side of the cabin. Not like claws, not like an animal rubbing against the wood. It was different, slow, almost testing. I stood as quietly as I could and reached for my flashlight. The firelight flickered across the walls as I moved. I went to the window and lifted the curtain just a sliver, peeking out. First, I didn't see anything, just the trees and the dark. But then something moved at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the dying fire's glow. It was tall, taller than any person, thin. Its limbs were too long, its head too small. The way it moved, it didn't seem right. It stepped forward, just a little, just enough that I could see the texture of its skin. Pale, almost gray, stretched too tight over its frame. I let the curtain fall. My heart hammered in my chest. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination, that maybe I was just seeing shadows wrong, that it was a trick of the firelight. But I knew better. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the chair, gripping the flashlight, staring at the door. The fire went cold, and I didn't dare move to stoke it. By morning, it was gone. I told myself I had imagined it, that maybe it was a moose sick or injured. Maybe it was a trick of the light. I told myself whatever I needed to get through the day. But the feeling never left. That sense of something just out of sight, just beyond the trees. That night, I locked the doors and windows, pulled the curtains tight. I kept the fire burning. I sat in the chair again, waiting. And again, just past midnight, I heard it. This time, it was closer. The footsteps circled the cabin. Slow, careful, like it was testing the walls, testing the doors. The sound of something dragging along the wood, that same soft scraping. Then, a knock. Not hard, not loud, just a soft tap, tap, tap. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My hands clenched so tight around the flashlight that my fingers ached. Another knock, and then, after a long silence, the sound of it moving away. I didn't sleep. When the sun finally came up, I made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my things as fast as I could, stuffing clothes into my bag, not bothering to fold them. I didn't care about the food. I just wanted to get out. I stepped onto the porch, gripping my truck keys. The forest was silent, too silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. The air was thick, heavy. And then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, large, deep, leading from the trees to my porch and back again. I didn't stop to look closer. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove. The trail was rough, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground, but I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. It wasn't until I was miles away, until I reached the highway, that I let out a breath. My hands were shaking on the wheel. I never went back. I never tried to find out what it was. Some places aren't meant to be lived in. Some things aren't meant to be seen. found the cabin by accident. I had been driving for hours, trying to outrun the storm rolling in behind me. The rain had started light, just a drizzle, but by the time I was deep in the woods, it was hammering down so hard I could barely see past my headlights. The road had turned to mud, my tires slipping and skidding, and when I saw the faint glow of a window through the trees, I made a split-second decision. I turned onto a narrow, overgrown path, barely wide enough for my car, and followed it until the cabin appeared through the rain. It was old, the wood dark and slick with moisture, but the chimney puffed out smoke. Someone was home. I didn't have a choice. I left the car running as I stepped out, soaked instantly. I knocked on the heavy wooden door. No answer. I knocked again, harder, waiting for movement inside. Still nothing. But the door was unlocked, and I needed shelter. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and old smoke. The room was small, just a single space with a cot in the corner, a wood stove against the wall, and a chair facing the window. The fire in the stove burned low. A mug sat on the table beside the chair, still half full. Someone had been here recently. I called out, but the wind and rain swallowed my voice. I stood still, listening. Nothing but the storm. I closed the door behind me, peeling my wet jacket off and setting it near the stove. I would wait for whoever lived here, explain the situation, and hope they didn't shoot me for trespassing. I wandered to the window, looking out into the trees. My car sat at the edge of the clearing, headlights dim from the rain, steam rising from the hood. Beyond that, the forest was a black wall. No sign of the person who belonged to this place. The storm raged on. I sat down in the chair, the old wood creaking beneath me. The warmth from the stove made my clothes stick to my skin, but I was grateful for it. I just needed to wait. An hour passed, then another. No one came. I searched the cabin. There wasn't much, just a few old clothes stuffed in a chest, a pile of firewood stacked in the corner, and some canned food on a shelf. No phone, no electricity. Whoever lived here, they didn't leave often. I tried to sleep in the chair, but the storm made it impossible. The rain pounded the roof, the wind howled through the trees, and every creak of the wood made my nerves jump. At some point, exhaustion won. I must have dozed off. I woke to silence. The storm had stopped. The fire in the stove had burned low, just glowing embers now. My neck ached from the awkward position in the chair. I stretched and stood, moving to the window. The forest was still, heavy with mist. My car was there, just as I left it. Everything looked untouched, but something felt off. A wrongness in the air, like the moment before a predator strikes. I turned to grab my jacket, and that's when I saw them. Boot prints. Fresh, wet boot prints leading from the door to where I had been sitting. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced to catch up. I had been alone. No one had come inside. I would have heard them. The prince stopped directly behind the chair. Whoever had been standing there had been watching me sleep. I swallowed hard, my heart hammering. My eyes darted to the door. It was still locked. My hands shook as I grabbed my jacket, my fingers fumbling with the damp fabric. I had to get out. Now, I turned to leave, but something outside caught my eye. My car. The driver's side door was open. I had locked it. I knew I had locked it. I took a slow step toward the window, barely breathing. The mist made it hard to see past the tree line, but there was something there. A shape, a person standing just beyond the reach of the clearing. Watching. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys from the table and ran for the door, yanking it open so fast it banged against the wall. The cold air hit me like a slap, but I didn't stop. I sprinted for the car, slipping in the mud, nearly falling. I lunged into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered, coughed, wouldn't start. I looked up. The person was gone. The forest loomed, empty and silent. Panic clawed at my throat. I turned the key again, harder this time. The engine roared to life. My tires spun in the mud as I threw the car into reverse, skidding backward onto the road. My headlights swept across the trees, And there they were, closer now, just standing there, watching me leave. I didn't look back again. I just drove, faster than I should have, barely able to keep the car steady on the slick dirt road. I didn't stop, not even when I reached the highway. Not until I saw another car, a gas station, people. I pulled into the parking lot and sat there, my hands still gripping the wheel, shaking. I looked at the empty passenger seat, at my wet clothes, at the muddy footprints smeared on my floor mat. Someone had been inside my car. I don't know who they were or what they wanted. I don't know how long they had been watching me, but I know one thing for sure. That cabin wasn't abandoned, and I had never been alone. It was early September when I set out for a solo backpacking trip in the Allegheny National Forest. The days were still warm, but the nights were beginning to carry a sharp bite, a warning that autumn was creeping in. I had spent 40 years hiking, camping, and exploring the eastern and central US, but this trip was meant to be different. I wanted to go deeper than I ever had before, away from the well-worn trails and familiar campsites. I wanted solitude, the kind that makes you feel like the only person left in the world. I parked at a small, nondescript pull-off on a service road and hiked in for most of the day, winding through dense, mixed hardwood forests and weaving my way up and down ridgelines. The forest was alive, but not in the way most people think. There were no constant sounds, no chatter of people or hum of distant traffic. Instead, the forest breathed with a rhythm of its own. The occasional crack of a twig breaking underfoot, the rustle of a squirrel scurrying through fallen leaves, the distant call of a lone bird echoing between the trees. By late afternoon, I found a spot to set up camp. It was nestled in a hollow, a small clearing surrounded by towering maples and hemlocks. A narrow stream cut through the valley, its water moving lazily over a bed of smooth stones. I strung my hammock between two sturdy trees, set up my tarp, and started gathering firewood. The quiet of the forest settled around me, the kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. As I cleared a small area to build a fire, I must have disturbed something without realizing it. I grabbed a fallen log to move it, and before I even registered what was happening, I felt a sharp sting on my arm, then another on my leg. Within seconds, my entire body erupted in pain. A swarm of bees, angry and relentless, came at me in a frenzy. I stumbled backward, swatting at them as best I could, but they were everywhere. My neck, my arms, even my face took hits. I could feel my skin swelling almost instantly. The pain was sharp and relentless, each sting setting my nerves on fire. I finally managed to get away, running blindly through the underbrush until I could breathe again. My hands trembled as I brushed the last of them away, my skin pulsing with heat and pain. I knew immediately that this was bad. I had a mild allergy to bee stings, not severe enough to carry an EpiPen, but enough that I'd always been cautious. My throat wasn't closing, but my breathing felt tight, like I had a heavy weight pressing on my chest. My arms were covered in welts, red and angry, and my skin felt hot to the touch. I forced myself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't do me any good out here, especially alone. I walked back to my campsite, moving slowly, my body aching with every step. My gear was scattered, my hammock slightly askew from my desperate escape. I didn't have any antihistamines, something I immediately regretted, but I had plenty of water. I drank deeply, then laid down in my hammock, hoping my body would settle down if I just gave it time. The forest around me was still. The usual evening sounds were there, the distant hoot of an owl, the chirping of crickets, but they felt different now, like I was hearing them through a thick fog. My body felt heavy, my arms ached, and my head was starting to pound. I forced myself to keep taking slow, deep breaths, counting each inhale, focusing on anything other than the pulsing pain under my skin. Time stretched. I lost track of how long I laid there, staring up at the canopy above me. The sky darkened, the last light of day filtering through the leaves in streaks of gold and orange before finally fading into darkness. I must have dozed off at some point, because I woke up to the sound of something moving in the brush nearby. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly turned my head, listening. It wasn't the quick, darting movement of a squirrel or a raccoon. This was heavier, deliberate. Something was out there. I held my breath, every sense on high alert. The pain from the stings was still there, but it was secondary now. My body was locked in place, waiting. The movement came again, a slow, steady rustling, the unmistakable sound of something large shifting through the undergrowth. A bear. I'd seen my fair share of them over the years, always from a safe distance. But this was different. I was alone, vulnerable, and still dealing with the aftermath of the stings. My food was hung in a tree a good distance away, but that didn't matter. If it wanted to come through camp, there wasn't much I could do about it. The noise came closer, branches snapping under its weight. I could barely make out a dark shape moving at the edge of my vision. My hands gripped the sides of the hammock, my breath shallow. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the movement stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, thick and unnatural. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, barely daring to breathe. Then, slowly, the sounds of the forest returned. Crickets chirped. Leaves rustled in the wind. Whatever it was had moved on. I didn't sleep much that night. My body ached. My skin burned. And every little sound sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through me. I lay in the darkness, waiting for the first light of dawn, counting the hours until I could break camp and head back. When the sky finally began to lighten, I wasted no time. My body still felt weak, but I forced myself to move. I packed up as quickly as I could, my hands shaking slightly from exhaustion and lingering fear. The hike back was long. Every step felt heavier than it should have, my limbs sluggish. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, now felt indifferent and vast. I was just another small thing moving through it, insignificant against the backdrop of towering trees and endless wilderness. When I finally saw my car, relief washed over me. I dropped my pack in the back seat, slid behind the wheel, and just sat there for a moment, letting the weight of the last 24 hours settle over me. The stings, the breathing, the bear. I had been close, too close to something going very wrong. I turned the key and started down the road, leaving the forest behind me. 40 years of camping, and it wasn't the bears, the storms, or the isolation that got me. It was the damn bees. The road leading to the cabin was nothing but dirt and gravel, barely wide enough for my truck. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches reaching over the road like clawed fingers. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving only the last scraps of orange light bleeding through the trees. I was miles from the nearest town, deep in the woods where the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling in the undergrowth. I had rented the cabin for the week, needing a break from work and the constant noise of the city. It was supposed to be quiet out here, peaceful. That was the whole point. A week alone, just me, the trees, and the river a short walk from the front porch. The cabin itself was small, a simple wooden structure with a tin roof that looked like it had been patched more than once. A single porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the clearing. I shut off the truck, stepping out into the cool evening air. The silence was immediate, almost oppressive. I could hear my own breathing, the crunch of dirt under my boots. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust. The furniture was sparse. A couch that looked like it had been there for decades, a small table, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. The kitchen was just a counter, a mini fridge, and an old gas stove. There was only one bedroom, with a bed pushed up against the far wall, covered in a thick quilt. The whole place felt still, like no one had been here in a long time. I set my bags down, unpacking only the essentials. Clothes, food, my rifle. I wasn't expecting trouble, but out here it was always better to be prepared. I locked the truck and went back inside, lighting the old oil lamp on the table. The power was unreliable in these parts, and I didn't trust the single exposed bulb hanging from the ceiling to last the night. The first night was quiet, too quiet. I sat on the porch for a while, listening. The usual sounds of the forest were there, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, but something felt off. I told myself it was just my imagination, the adjustment from city noise to wilderness silence. Eventually, I went inside and locked the door behind me. The bed was stiff, the blanket scratchy, but exhaustion won out, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Somewhere in the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The room was dark, the air still. Then I heard it, a sound from outside, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the gravel. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped. I listened for what felt like forever, but there was nothing. Maybe an animal, I thought, a deer or a raccoon. I rolled over and tried to ignore the unease crawling up my spine. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no tracks, nothing disturbed. Maybe I had imagined it. Still, I kept my rifle closer that day. I spent most of the time by the river, fishing, trying to push away the nagging feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, it happened again. The same slow footsteps, closer this time. I lay in bed, my hand gripping the rifle. Then a soft sound, a creak, the front porch. I sat up, heart hammering. The lamp on the table cast just enough light to show the door. The old wood groaned again, like weight shifting. I stayed frozen, listening. Then, nothing. Just silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but the sounds didn't return. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again. In the morning, I checked the porch. The dust was disturbed. Just a little. Not enough to be sure, but enough to make me feel uneasy. I told myself it had to be an animal. Something wandering up, sniffing around. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. That night, I sat by the door, rifle across my lap, lamp burning low. I waited, and then I heard it. Not just footsteps this time. Breathing. Low, slow, right outside the door. I gripped the rifle tighter, every muscle tense. The door handle rattled. Once, then again. I stood, stepping closer, the wooden floor creaking beneath me. The handle stopped moving. The breathing stopped. I ripped the door open, raising the rifle. Nothing. The porch was empty. The clearing beyond was still, shadows stretching from the trees. I stepped out, scanning the darkness. The woods loomed, thick and impenetrable. I shut the door and locked it. I didn't sleep. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my things, throwing everything into the truck. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't even try to turn over. I popped the hood, checking the battery. The cables were gone. Cut. Panic settled in my stomach like a heavy stone. Whoever had been outside my cabin last night had done this. They didn't want me leaving. I grabbed my rifle and started walking. The nearest town was miles away, but I wasn't staying here another night. I stuck to the road, my pace quick but steady. The forest was silent around me. Too silent. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of my boots crunching on gravel. Then, ahead of me, something in the road. I stopped. A dead deer. Fresh. His throat had been slit, blood pooling across the dirt. And beside it, footprints. Not animal prints. Boots, leading back toward my cabin. I turned and ran. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs threatened to give out. And then, finally, I saw headlights. A truck. A real, solid truck, coming up the road. I stumbled into the middle of the path, waving my arms. The driver, a man in his 50s, slammed the brakes, staring at me like I was a lunatic. I didn't care. I climbed into his truck, gasping out half-coherent words about someone being at my cabin. Someone cutting my truck's cables. Someone waiting. He turned his truck around without asking questions. Drove me straight into town. I never went back for my truck. Never went back for my things. I don't know who was out there in those woods. I don't want to know. All I know is that I left that cabin standing, door locked, lights off, and someone who wasn't me, was watching it from the trees as we drove away. I drove up the narrow, winding road, my tires crunching over loose gravel as I climbed deeper into the forest. It was late afternoon, but the trees were thick, their towering trunks swallowing most of the light. The air smelled of damp earth and pine. I had rented a cabin for the weekend, far from the city, hoping to clear my head. Work had been relentless, and I needed space, the kind of quiet only deep woods could offer. The cabin sat at the end of a long, rutted dirt driveway. It was small, weathered, the wood gray from years of harsh seasons. The windows were dark, almost blending into the thick tree line behind it. A rusted metal sign near the front porch read, "Private Property." I stepped out of the car and stretched, my muscles stiff from the drive. There wasn't another house or person for miles. That was part of the appeal. Inside, the air was cool and stale. The cabin had been cleaned, but it still smelled faintly of damp wood and dust. A small fireplace sat against the far wall, an old couch and a wooden rocking chair nearby. The kitchen was basic: a single burner stove, a scratched-up counter, and a half-sized fridge humming in the corner. There was a narrow hallway leading to a single bedroom and a tiny bathroom. The whole place felt old but solid, built long before my time. The first few hours were peaceful. I unpacked, made a quick meal, and stepped onto the porch with a beer. The sun was slipping behind the trees, casting long shadows. It was dead silent, apart from the occasional rustling in the underbrush. Birds had long since settled in for the night. I sat there, just listening to the stillness, feeling the weight of exhaustion start to lift. Then I heard it, a snap somewhere in the woods behind the cabin, a branch breaking underfoot. I tensed, straining to hear past the pounding in my ears. The forest was too dense to see far, but I knew that sound. Something big had stepped on that branch. A deer, maybe. A bear, possibly. I waited, listening, but there was nothing more. After a few minutes, I forced myself to relax. It was normal. The woods were full of life. Night came fast. I locked up and crawled into bed, the mattress thin and uneven. The silence outside was heavy, pressing against the cabin walls. I drifted in and out of sleep, restless, my body still adjusting to the quiet. Then something woke me, a noise faint but distinct, a shuffling sound. I held my breath, my ears straining. It was outside, near the front of the cabin. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. My pulse hammered. I stayed still, barely breathing. The footsteps moved closer, stopping near the door. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. I hadn't expected much this deep in the woods, but now I cursed myself for it. My hand trembled as I slid out of bed as quietly as possible. I crept toward the window, moving slowly to avoid the creaking floorboards. The porch was empty, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Then, a sound at the back of the cabin. The soft, deliberate scrape of something against the wood. My stomach clenched. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped toward the back window. The beam cut through the dark, revealing the dense wall of trees. Nothing else, but something had been there. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of the cabin, every shift in the wind had me sitting up, listening. But the night passed without another sound. When morning finally came, I stepped outside. The ground was damp with dew, the air crisp. I walked around the cabin, searching for any sign that someone or something had been there. Near the back, just beneath the bedroom window, were faint imprints in the soft earth. Footprints, human. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hunter had wandered too close. Maybe it was nothing. But I knew that wasn't true. Someone had been standing there in the dark, watching my cabin. Watching me. I wanted to leave. My gut told me to pack up and go, but I pushed the thought away. It was probably just some local passing through. I refused to let paranoia ruin my weekend. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease from the night before. But it lingered. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the leaves had me turning my head. That night, I locked the cabin up tight. I moved a chair under the doorknob, securing it further. I kept the flashlight within reach, my ears tuned to every sound. Hours passed. The wind picked up, making the trees groan. The night stretched on. Then, just past 2 in the morning, I heard it again. The slow creak of a footstep on the porch. I gripped the flashlight, my pulse a steady drum in my ears. The footsteps moved, stopping just outside the door. A long pause. Then, a low, slow scraping sound, like nails dragging against the wood. My skin went cold. I wanted to move, to do something, but I was frozen, barely breathing. The sound stopped. Silence. The kind that felt too heavy, too deliberate. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn filtered through the trees. When I finally opened the door, my stomach dropped. A long, thin scratch ran across the wood, from the top of the frame down to the handle. I left that morning. I didn't pack neatly. I didn't stop to make breakfast. I just threw my things into the car and drove, my hands tight on the wheel. The feeling didn't leave me, not even after I hit the main road. It sat heavy in my gut, a lingering sense of something unfinished. Days later, back in the city, I still couldn't shake it. The footprints, the slow, deliberate movements, the scratch on the door. It hadn't been an animal, and it hadn't been an accident. Someone had been out there, someone had been watching, and they had waited until the darkest hours to make themselves known.